Phil Hardberger Park, a 330-acre natural haven in San Antonio, Texas, is a place where urban life meets the wild. With its extensive trails, diverse ecosystems, and rich history, it offers a unique escape from the city's hustle and bustle. My friend Jake and I often sought refuge there, drawn by its serene landscapes and the promise of adventure. One overcast afternoon in early February, we decided to explore the park's lesser-known trails. The sky was a canvas of gray, and a light drizzle had begun, but that didn't deter us. Equipped with our cameras, we embarked on a project, creating a mockumentary about a mythical creature rumored to inhabit the park's depths. We entered through the NW Military Highway entrance, greeted by the familiar sight of the Urban Ecology Center. From there, we ventured onto the Savannah Loop Trail, a 1.84-mile path that meanders through restored grasslands and woodlands. The trail was damp, and the earthy scent of wet soil filled the air. Birdsong occasionally pierced the silence, but as we delved deeper, even that faded, leaving only the sound of our footsteps and the gentle patter of rain. Our journey led us to the restored wetland area, a secluded spot teeming with life. Tall grasses swayed gently, and the occasional ripple on the water's surface hinted at unseen creatures below. It was here that we decided to film a segment, with Jake narrating and me handling the camera. Jake stood near the water's edge, describing the habitat of our fictional creature. His voice was steady, and the scene seemed perfect. However, as I reviewed the footage on the camera's small screen, I noticed something odd. At the very beginning of the clip, there was a brief, hostile snarl, followed by a faint voice whispering, "Catch up." The voice was neither mine nor Jake's, and it sent a chill down my spine. I showed the clip to Jake, and he was equally perplexed. We replayed it multiple times, trying to decipher the origin of the sounds. The snarl could have been an animal, perhaps a coyote or a feral hog, both known to inhabit the area. But the whisper, it was unmistakably human. Determined to find a logical explanation, we decided to retrace our steps. The rain had intensified, and the park's trails were now slick and muddy. As we walked, we called out, hoping to encounter another visitor who might have been the source of the voice. But the park seemed deserted. We reached the spot where we had filmed and stood in silence, listening. The only sounds were the rain hitting the leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. No snarls, no whispers, just the oppressive weight of the storm. Feeling uneasy, we decided to head back. As we approached the trailhead, Jake stopped suddenly. He pointed to the ground, where fresh footprints were visible in the mud. They were human, barefoot, and larger than either of ours. The prints led off the trail and into the dense underbrush. A sense of dread settled over us. Whoever had made those prints was out there, barefoot in the rain, watching us. The realization was unsettling. We quickened our pace, eager to reach the safety of the main road. Back at the parking lot, we sat in the car, drenched and silent. The day's events replayed in our minds, each detail more disturbing than the last. We agreed to report the incident to the park authorities, hoping they could provide some answers. The following day, we met with a park ranger and recounted our experience. He listened attentively, his expression serious. When we showed him the footage, he frowned and explained that while the park is home to various wildlife, none would produce a sound resembling a human whisper. As for the footprints, he acknowledged that there had been occasional reports of transient individuals passing through the area, but none had ever exhibited hostile behavior. Unsatisfied but resigned, we left the ranger's office. Over the next few days, I tried to transfer the video from my camera to my computer, but inexplicably, the file was corrupted. Frustrated, I set the camera aside, intending to seek professional help later. Weeks turned into months, and the incident became a distant memory, overshadowed by the demands of daily life. One evening, while cleaning my apartment, I stumbled upon my old phone, the one with the burned-out screen. Curious, I charged it and connected it to my computer, hoping to retrieve any old photos or videos. To my surprise, among the files was a video dated the day of our visit to Hardburger Park. I played it, and there it was. The same snarl, the same whisper, "Catch up!" But this time, the video continued beyond what I remembered. The camera, seemingly on its own, panned to the underbrush, focusing on a shadowy figure standing among the trees. The figure was tall, gaunt, and unmistakably human. As the video ended, a chilling realization washed over me. We were not alone that day. I contacted Jake and showed him the recovered footage. We debated what to do next. In the end, we decided to share the video with the park authorities. The road stretched ahead of us, cracked and beaten, riddled with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. Dust floated low to the ground, never fully settling, shifting like a living thing under the car's headlights. On either side, the trees stood bare and skeletal, their grayish bark blending into the overcast sky. It was the kind of landscape that made everything feel quiet, even though the car's tires bounced over the rough pavement, jostling us in our seats. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my best friend in the passenger seat beside me, both of us growing tenser with each passing mile. We had been driving north from Central California, heading toward Canada, hoping to camp along the way. It had seemed like a great idea at first, an open-ended road trip, sleeping under the stars, taking in the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But as the hours dragged on, it became painfully clear that we had underestimated how difficult it would be to find a campsite. Every place we passed was either full or completely inaccessible. Some were so packed that people had resorted to setting up tents in the parking lot, while others were so deep into the woods that they required hiking miles off the road to even reach them. And the road itself, it was exhausting. Every bump rattled through the car, and the farther we drove, the worse it got. The trees on both sides stood like silent sentinels, looming, watching. At least that's how it felt. Every few seconds, I'd catch a shape in my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless. But when I looked directly at it, it was just another tree, just another trick of the light, the way the branches curled in just the right way to resemble shoulders, the way the bark split to resemble eyes. Kept happening over and over, enough times that I started to ignore it. I focused on the road, but the feeling never fully went away. The monochrome landscape stretched on forever. The trees, the dust, the gray sky blending into a dull, lifeless haze. Even the air smelled stale. Not bad necessarily, just off. I rolled the window down, expecting to smell pine or damp earth, but all I got was something sharp and bitter, like decaying leaves mixed with stagnant water. And then, as if the universe had heard my thoughts and wanted to make things worse, the smell changed. I don't know how to describe it. It was foul, but not in the way of rotten food or roadkill. It was deeper than that, heavier, like something old and wet and diseased had been sitting out in the heat for too long. I gagged and rolled the window back up, but it didn't help much. The smell had already seeped into the car. This place sucks, I thought to myself. But at that point, we were beyond exhausted. There was no way we could keep driving without some rest. We pulled into the first clearing we could find, a patch of flat ground barely off the road, surrounded by more of those lifeless trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was big enough for the car and a small tent. I killed the engine, and the silence swallowed us. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the lingering stench and the distant sound of our car cooling down, ticking as the metal settled. The moment I stepped outside, the feeling hit me like a weight pressing against my chest. Something about this place was wrong. My skin crawled, my stomach twisted, and every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car and keep driving. But I was exhausted, and exhaustion makes you ignore your instincts. We set up the tent quickly, barely speaking. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, and I definitely wasn't the type to invite creepy thoughts into my head while camping. I enjoyed being outside too much for that. But here, in this place, it was impossible to ignore. Still, I pushed it down, crawled into my sleeping bag, and told myself I was being ridiculous. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep at first. Everything was still and quiet. I could hear my friend breathing beside me, slow and even. Outside, nothing moved. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I heard it, a noise just outside the tent. It was close, too close, a soft, deliberate sound, like something pressing into the dirt, shifting weight, dragging slightly. Not fast, not clumsy, controlled. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted it to be a bear. I hoped it was a bear, but there was no huffing, no sniffing, no sound of claws scraping bark or heavy paws crunching leaves. Just that slow, measured shifting circling the tent. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling of the tent, my muscles locked in place. Then, like an idiot, I remembered, earlier that evening, before crawling into my sleeping bag, I had shaved my legs right next to the tent. Just a quick, careless job with some soap and cold water. I didn't even think about it at the time, but now, lying in the dark, it hit me all at once. I had left my scent right outside. I wanted to kick myself. My brain raced through options. Should I make noise? Play dead? Unzip the tent and run? But where would I even go? The car was too far, and the idea of stepping outside, fully exposed, made my skin crawl. I turned my head slightly, trying to see if my friend was awake. That's when I realized the sound was coming from her side of the tent, right next to her. Panicked, I had to wake her up. I had to let her know. My fingers clenched into the fabric of my sleeping bag, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would shake the tent itself. I reached out, barely nudging her shoulder, and the noise stopped. Instantly, like it had never been there at all. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stayed still, listening, waiting, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so tense. Eventually, I forced myself to relax, inch by inch, convincing myself that whatever it was had left. I must have drifted back to sleep at some point because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the fabric of the tent, and everything felt normal again. Then my friend stretched, yawned, and rolled over, and I heard the sound, the same low, shifting rustle, the same dragging noise, the noise that had kept me paralyzed in terror for half the night. I froze, my entire body going cold. Then she snored. The realization hit me all at once, so hard I almost laughed out loud. It had been her the whole time. The noises, the shifting, the soft dragging. It was just the sound of her moving in her sleep. I felt like the biggest idiot on the planet. All that fear, all that time lying there, thinking I was about to get mauled or worse, and it was just my best friend rolling around in her sleeping bag. We packed up quickly and got the hell out of there. I didn't even realize how badly that place had affected me until we were back on the road. The air clear, the trees looking normal again, the smell gone. Later, when we checked the map and looked up the area we had camped in, we learned something interesting. It was prime Bigfoot country. Go figure. I don't know what we actually experienced that night. Whether it was just my mind playing tricks on me, exhaustion, paranoia, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp there again. I've been camping all my life. My dad took me on my first trip when I was 6, and from then on, it became something I did every summer. I liked it best when I was alone, Just me, a tent, and miles of wilderness. There was something peaceful about it, being away from people, away from noise. But one trip almost made me quit for good. It was late September, right at the start of fall. I had taken a week off work and planned a solo trip into a remote section of the Cascade Mountains. I had been there before, but never this deep. The area wasn't popular, too rugged, too unpredictable. That's what I liked about it. No crowded trails, no tourists, just wilderness. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked deep into the mountains, following a rough, overgrown trail that had probably been used by hunters decades ago. I set up camp near a creek, cooked my meals over a fire, and slept under the stars. The air was crisp, the trees were turning gold, and the only sounds were the wind and the distant rush of water. The third day is when things went wrong. I woke up to the sound of wind whipping through the trees. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the sky had turned a dull gray. A storm was coming. I had checked the weather before the trip, and it was supposed to be clear all week, but the mountains don't care about forecasts. I packed up quickly, not wanting to get caught in the rain. My plan was to head back toward the trailhead, but instead of retracing my steps, I decided to take a different route. A shortcut, I thought. The map showed a narrow valley that led back to the main trail, cutting off several miles. It looked straightforward. It wasn't. At first, the terrain was manageable. The valley was steep, but the ground was firm, and there were plenty of trees to grab onto. The wind picked up as I went deeper, and the first drops of rain started falling. Within an hour, it turned into a full-blown storm. The rain came down in sheets, soaking me to the bone. The temperature dropped fast, and the wind howled through the valley like a freight train. The trail, if it could even be called that, became a muddy mess. My boots sank into the ground with every step. That's when I realized my mistake. The valley wasn't a shortcut. It was a drainage. The storm had turned it into a funnel for all the water coming down from the mountains. What had been dry ground an hour ago was now a raging stream, and I was in the middle of it. I tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The water was rising fast, turning the trail into a rushing current. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, hoping to find higher ground. I pushed ahead, fighting against the wind and rain. My pack felt heavier with every step, my boots slipping on the wet ground. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Every time I thought I found solid ground, the mud gave way, sending me sliding down. Then I heard it, a deep, thunderous roar. I stopped, straining to see through the rain. The valley ahead of me was narrowing, and that's when I realized what the sound was: water. A lot of it. A flash flood. Panic set in. I turned, scrambling up the steep slope to my right. The ground was nothing but mud and wet leaves, but I climbed anyway, digging my hands into the dirt, pulling myself up inch by inch. The roar grew louder. I looked down just in time to see a wall of water surging through the valley, sweeping away everything in its path. Trees snapped like twigs. Rocks the size of cars tumbled past. If I had been 5 minutes slower, I would have been in the middle of it. I didn't stop climbing. My arms burned, my legs ached, but I kept going until I reached a small ledge about 20 feet up. It wasn't much, but it was high enough to keep me out of the flood. I collapsed onto my back, gasping for air, the rain pounding against my face. I was alive, but I was stuck. The valley below was now a raging river, cutting off my escape. The slope above me was too steep to climb. My only option was to wait out the storm. For hours, I sat there, shivering, watching the floodwaters rage below. My hands were numb, my clothes soaked through. I had no way to start a fire, no way to signal for help. My only hope was that the storm would pass before nightfall. Didn't. By the time darkness fell, the rain was still coming down in sheets. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. I knew I couldn't stay put all night. I would freeze to death. I had to move. I took off my pack and dug through it with shaking hands. My flashlight was dead. My phone had no signal. The only thing I had was a cheap emergency poncho and a granola bar. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. I needed the energy. Then I pulled the poncho over my head and started moving sideways along the ledge, feeling my way through the darkness. The wind howled through the valley, shaking the trees above me. Every step felt like it could be my last. The ground was slick, the rocks loose. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. At some point, I slipped. My foot caught on a loose rock, and suddenly I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I just lay there, too stunned to move. Then, slowly, I rolled onto my side and tried to sit up. Pain shot through my ankle. I had landed in a pile of wet leaves and mud, but my foot had twisted underneath me. I knew immediately it was either sprained or broken. I bit down a scream and forced myself to stand. I couldn't put weight on my right foot, so I leaned against a tree, breathing through the pain. I needed to find shelter. I limped forward, using the trees for support. The storm had finally started to weaken, but the damage was done. The ground was a swamp, and the air was ice cold. Then, through the darkness, I saw it. A rock overhang, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't much, just a shallow cave carved into the side of the valley, but it was dry. I stumbled inside and collapsed against the wall, exhausted. For the first time that night, I felt a shred of relief. I was out of the rain, out of the wind. I could rest. I huddled against the rock, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. My ankle throbbed, but there was nothing I could do about it. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The rain had stopped. I crawled to the entrance of the cave and looked out. The valley below was unrecognizable. The flood had torn through everything, leaving behind nothing but mud and debris. Trees were uprooted, boulders had been displaced, and the trail I had followed was completely gone. But the sky was clear. I used a stick as a crutch and started moving, slowly making my way toward higher ground. It took me the entire day, but by late afternoon, I found the main trail again. When I finally reached my car, I didn't feel relief, I just felt numb. I sat there for a long time, staring at the forest, thinking about how easily things could have ended differently. I had been lucky. That was the last time I went camping alone. I never believed in curses. Not really. I'd heard the stories, the ones locals whispered about spirits hiding travelers, making them vanish from their groups. I'd laughed at the warnings about angels punishing hikers who misbehaved in the jungle. To me, it was just folklore, something to scare kids or keep tourists from doing stupid things. But after what happened to me, I don't laugh anymore. It started as a simple camping trip. A few of us had planned to spend the weekend deep in one of Thailand's national parks, away from the crowded cities, away from the noise. Just a few days of hiking, swimming in waterfalls, and sleeping under the stars. Nothing dangerous, nothing extreme. We weren't thrill seekers. We just wanted some quiet. The first day was fine. Hot, humid, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming flowers. We followed a well-worn trail through the jungle, the kind used by other hikers. Sometimes we'd pass small shrines, statues of old monks covered in moss, offerings of fruit and incense left behind by travelers. I'd seen similar things in other parts of Thailand, but here, deep in the jungle, they felt different. Older, heavier. I should have known better than to be careless around them. Sometime in the late afternoon, we reached a clearing near a small river where we set up camp. It was a good spot, flat ground, plenty of space, and the sound of rushing water nearby. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and sat around eating the food we'd packed. That was when I made my mistake. Near the edge of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was an old stone. Not a normal rock, but something carved, weathered by time, but clearly shaped by human hands. It was small, smooth, with faded etchings that looked like writing, though I couldn't read it. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe because it looked interesting. Maybe because I wasn't thinking. I just wiped off the dirt and slipped it into my pocket. That night, everything changed. I woke up sometime past midnight, sweating despite the cool night air. The jungle was too quiet. No insects buzzing, no distant calls of animals. Just silence, deep and unnatural. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the uneasy feeling pressing down on me. Something felt wrong. I stepped out of my tent, expecting to see the dying embers of our fire, maybe one of my friends awake and keeping watch. But the campsite was empty. The fire was out. The tents were still there, but something was missing. The others. I called out. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. Just empty tents, as if my friends had never been there to begin with. Panic settled in my chest like a stone. I tried to think logically. Maybe they'd gone to the river. Maybe they'd gone to relieve themselves. But all of them, at once, without waking me, I turned in a slow circle, shining my light into the trees. That was when I saw it. A figure. Not a person, not really. Just a shape, standing deep in the jungle, half hidden in the shadows. My flashlight barely touched it before the beam flickered, then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. I froze. I could feel something watching me, just beyond the reach of my vision. Then came the footsteps, not loud, but deliberate, circling me. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and the air grew heavy, pressing against my skin. I ran, not toward the river, not toward any familiar path, just away, deeper into the jungle, driven by pure instinct. The branches tore at my clothes, my arms, my face. Roots snagged my feet, sending me sprawling into the dirt, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I couldn't run anymore. When I finally collapsed, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangling together to block out the sky. My flashlight was useless. My phone had no signal. I was alone, or so I thought. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The jungle around me felt wrong, like I had stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the silence was unbearable. Then, from somewhere close, too close, I heard breathing. Not an animal, not a person, something in between. I shut my eyes, gripping my useless flashlight like a weapon. Whatever it was, it didn't touch me. It didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for the first hint of dawn. When morning came, I forced myself to move. My legs were sore, my body covered in scratches. I didn't know which way to go, but I had no choice but to walk. I don't know how long I wandered before I stumbled onto something familiar. A trail, barely visible but real. I followed it, praying it would lead me back. By mid-morning, I reached the campsite. It was exactly as we'd left it. The tents, the firewood, the scattered belongings. And my friends, still asleep in their tents, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, shaking, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined everything? No, my clothes were still torn. My arms and legs were covered in cuts from the jungle. I hadn't dreamed it. Something had happened. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers brushed against something smooth, the stone. I pulled it out and stared at it. I don't know why, but I felt sick holding it. Without thinking, I walked straight to the river and threw it in. I didn't tell the others what happened. I didn't need to. When we left the jungle later that day, I felt it. The weight lifting, the air growing lighter, as if something had finally let me go. I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to go camping there. Maybe because my friends insisted it would be fine. Maybe because I thought the stories were exaggerated. But mostly, I think, because I didn't want to look like a coward. The lake wasn't far from where I lived, maybe an hour's drive. It was one of those places that seemed normal during the day, peaceful, even families came to swim, fish, and picnic. It was the kind of place where you'd see kids running along the shore, kicking up water, where couples would set up hammocks between the trees and nap in the breeze. But no one talked about what happened there at night. Not out loud, at least. People whispered about the bear attack, how a family had been killed in their sleep. Mother, father, little boy, mauled so badly that the bodies were barely recognizable. Then there were the rumors about satanic rituals, about people in robes chanting deep in the woods, about strange figures seen walking along the roads after dark. My older brother had seen them himself once. A group of people standing in a clearing, their low voices carrying through the trees. He and his friends had shut off their flashlights and crouched in silence, too scared to move until the chanting faded. That was enough to keep most people away after sunset. But we thought we'd be fine. There were 3 of us, me, Jacob, and Anthony. We planned to camp by the water, not too far from the old cabins where the family had died. That had been years ago, and the cabins had been left abandoned, rotting under the weight of time. No one used them anymore. The park rangers didn't even bother fixing them up. We got there in the afternoon, setting up our tent near the shoreline. The lake stretched out before us, still and dark, the trees pressing in from all sides. I could see the cabins from where we stood, their roofs sagging, windows black and empty. Felt wrong even then. Something about the air, about the silence. But I ignored it. We spent most of the day fishing, catching nothing but small sunfish we threw back. We ate sandwiches and chips from our coolers, walked along the water, skipped rocks. The sun was hot on our backs, and for a while it was easy to forget the stories. Then the sun started to go down. That's when the feeling changed. It started with the quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet you get in the woods at night. This was different. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had gone still. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of the water lapping against the shore. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Jacob was the first to say something about it. "It's too quiet," he muttered, tossing a rock into the lake. I watched the ripples spread, then vanish. Anthony laughed, but it was forced. "Come on, man. It's just nightfall. Animals settle down." But I could tell he felt it too. We sat by the fire as it got darker, the glow flickering over our faces. The sky turned deep purple, then black. The only light came from our fire and the moon reflecting off the lake. The cabins were just dark shapes in the distance. We didn't talk much. Then we heard it. It was a low, rhythmic sound, drifting through the trees, chanting. The hair on my arms stood up. It was faint at first, like a breeze carrying voices from far away. But as we listened, it became clearer. Deep, slow, methodical. I looked at Jacob. His face was pale in the firelight. Anthony grabbed a flashlight, pointed it toward the woods. "You think it's other campers?" he whispered. I shook my head. Who the hell does that at night? The chanting didn't stop. It rose and fell, like a slow, twisted hymn. It was coming from the direction of the cabins. I didn't want to move. But I didn't want to sit there either. Jacob swallowed hard. "We should go." I nodded. We packed fast, not bothering to fold the tent properly, just shoving everything into our bags. The chanting kept going, steady and unbroken. It didn't sound rushed or frantic. It sounded deliberate, like whoever was out there had done this before, like they knew we were listening. We turned off our flashlights. The fire crackled behind us as we started walking back toward the car. It was a half-mile away, up a dirt path that wound through the woods. Normally, it wouldn't have been a long walk, but that night it felt endless. The chanting faded as we moved away. Then something else replaced it. Footsteps, somewhere behind us, heavy and slow. Not an animal. Too steady. I didn't look back. Neither did Jacob or Anthony. We just walked faster. The footsteps sped up. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. The path felt longer than I remembered, the trees pressing in too close. The car was still nowhere in sight. Then, from behind us, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. Anthony broke. He bolted. Jacob and I didn't hesitate. We ran. Branches whipped against my arms as I sprinted up the path. My legs burned. My lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. The footsteps behind us didn't stop either. They stayed close. I don't know how far we ran. Maybe 100 yards. Maybe more. But suddenly, the path opened up, and the car was right there. Anthony fumbled for the keys, yanking the door open. Jacob and I dove inside, slamming the doors shut. For a second, all I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, through the trees, I saw movement. Not a person. Something bigger. It was standing just beyond the tree-line, barely visible in the dark. But the shape of it was unmistakable. A bear. My chest tightened. The stories came rushing back. The family. The attack. I could see its eyes reflecting in the car's headlights, glowing faintly. It wasn't moving, just watching. Anthony turned the key. The engine roared to life. The bear twitched. Then it stepped forward. The car lurched forward, gravel kicking up under the tires. I watched as the bear took another step, then stopped. It didn't charge. It didn't run. It just stood there watching us leave. We didn't slow down. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the highway, the lake disappearing into the darkness behind us. No one spoke for a long time. Then Jacob exhaled sharply. "That wasn't just some bear wandering through camp," he muttered. I didn't answer, because he was right. We never went back. We never told anyone what happened. Not really. If we did, we left parts out. No one would believe us anyway. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that place. The silence, the chanting, the bear standing at the edge of the woods, just watching. And I wonder if we were really supposed to leave that night, or if we just got lucky. Camping has always been my escape. I've camped up and down the West Coast, from the rugged cliffs of Monterey Bay to the misty shores of Port Townsend, and nothing has ever shaken me, except for one night near the Hoh Rainforest. I'd always heard about the beauty of the Olympic coast, how it was one of the most remote, untouched places in the country. Towering Sitka spruces, ferns as tall as my chest, beaches littered with massive driftwood logs. It was a dream. And the rainforests, they were something else entirely. Everything felt alive. The trees dripped with moss, their massive trunks reaching into the sky like ancient guardians. Even on a clear day, the canopy filtered the sunlight into something softer, dimmer. It made everything feel still, hushed, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's what drew me in. That feeling of being completely removed from the rest of the world. I had planned a short solo trip to one of the hiking sites near the Hoh River. Nothing crazy, just a couple of nights, some good hiking, Maybe a bit of fishing if I found a decent spot along the river. I wasn't worried about safety. I had my bare canister, proper food storage, and a good knife. I knew how to handle myself in the woods. The hike in was beautiful. The trail wove through towering trees, the ground soft underfoot from years of fallen pine needles. Birds called from the branches, and every now and then, I'd hear the distant rush of the river through the trees. I passed a couple of other hikers on their way out, but by the time I reached my campsite, I was alone. The spot was perfect. A small clearing with just enough space for my tent, a fire ring made of old stones, and a thick log that made for a decent seat. Just beyond the site, the forest sloped down toward the river, maybe a 5-minute walk away. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started gathering firewood. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I cooked a simple meal, watched the fire crackle, and let the sound of the river lull me to sleep. It was the second night when things changed. I woke up suddenly. No reason at first, just that strange feeling of being pulled from deep sleep into full awareness. The kind where you're not groggy, just alert. I lay still, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, because when you're in the woods, there's always noise. Crickets whined through the trees, the distant rush of water. But right then, nothing. Then I heard it, something moving outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a raccoon, maybe sniffing around for food. I had stored everything properly, though, so there shouldn't have been anything to attract animals. Still, I figured I'd spooked a curious critter. But then I heard it again, heavier this time, slow, deliberate. Not the skittering of a raccoon, not the soft padding of a deer. This was something big. I reached for my camp lantern, my fingers fumbling over the switch. The fabric of the tent barely muffled the sound of my own breathing. The movement outside stopped for a moment, then shifted again. That's when I heard it. A low, deep growl, not like a bear huffing, not like a cougar scream. This was deeper, rough, not loud, but intentional. Every hair on my body stood on end. Instinct took over, and before I even realized what I was doing, I shut off the lantern and dropped to the ground. My heart pounded so hard I thought whatever was outside would hear it. Silence. No movement.
No breathing.
Nothing. And that was somehow worse. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything. When your adrenaline kicks in, it's like your senses go into overdrive. You notice everything, but I heard nothing at all. And I lay there like that for hours. I must have stayed frozen on the floor of my tent until my body ached. Every minute dragged on, stretched thin by fear. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, the dim light of early morning was filtering through the tent walls. I sat up slowly, my muscles stiff, my heart still pounding in my chest. I listened. Birds, the distant rush of the river, normal sounds. The world had come back to life. I unzipped the tent carefully, scanning the area. Everything looked normal. My fire pit was undisturbed. My pack was exactly where I left it. Nothing was torn up, nothing was missing. But something had been out there. I knew it. I got up and started looking for tracks. The ground was soft, a mix of damp earth and pine needles, perfect for leaving footprints. I checked everywhere, around my tent, near the trees by the fire ring. Nothing. No broken branches.
No disturbed dirt. No claw marks.
It made no sense. The whole thing made me feel unsteady, like my brain couldn't reconcile what had happened with the lack of evidence. But I knew better than to ignore my gut. Something had been there, something big enough to shift its weight like a predator, something that wanted me to know it was there. And then, nothing. I packed up my camp as fast as I could. By the time I made it back to my car, I knew I had to stop by the ranger station. Not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to tell someone. Maybe they'd had reports of bears acting weird. Maybe a cougar had been spotted in the area. The ranger on duty was a guy in his 40s, friendly but no nonsense. I told him about the night, about the growl, about the silence afterward. He listened carefully. Then he frowned. "That doesn't sound like a bear," he said, almost to himself. I asked him if anyone had reported anything strange. He hesitated. Then he told me to wait while he grabbed the keys to one of their jeeps. Said he'd go check the area himself. I waited outside, leaning against my car, still trying to shake the lingering unease in my chest. He was gone for about an hour. When he came back, he looked off. Not scared, exactly, but tense. He climbed out of the jeep, shook his head, and said he hadn't found anything. No tracks.
No scat.
No signs of a large animal. Then he told me to let them know if I ever camped in that area again and heard anything else. That was it.
No explanations. No reassurances.
Just that one look on his face. Like whatever had been out there had rattled him, too. I never went back to that spot. I still camp all over the coast, but something about the Olympic wilderness. The deep, endless forests, the thick, pressing silence, stayed with me. People always talk about how the woods at night make you feel small. But that night, I didn't feel small. I felt watched. And I'll never forget that feeling as long as I live. And camping in the South African wilderness at 13 years old should have been an adventure. The kind of trip you look back on fondly years later, laughing about the small struggles and remembering the good times. And in a way, it was. But there are moments that stand out, ones that never fade, and that night by the river, surrounded by the eerie, growing sounds of hyenas, remains burned into my memory. Our school trip had been planned for months. It was meant to be an outdoor experience, a way for us to connect with nature, learn some survival skills, and toughen up a bit. We were about 40 to 50 boys, all around the same age, with a handful of teachers and guides leading the way. The trip was a mix of hiking through the national park and setting up camp at different locations each night. For 2 nights, we stayed in cabins, simple structures but comfortable enough. The other 2 nights were spent in tents, though calling them tents might be a stretch. They were more like large, open shelters, providing some cover from the rain but offering no walls, no protection from anything that might wander too close in the dark. That night, we had set up camp near a river. The location had been chosen for its access to water, and because it was a flat, open area that could accommodate our entire group. The river was shallow where we camped, just enough to wash up in and cool off, though further downstream, it deepened and moved faster. We were tired from the day's hike, but there was still a sense of excitement in the air as we set up our shelters, gathered firewood, and prepared for another night under the stars. Dinner was simple, something cooked over the fire, though I can't even remember what it was. At that point in the trip, food was just fuel, nothing special. We ate quickly, cleaned up, and settled in as the night fell around us. The fire burned bright in the center of our camp, casting flickering shadows across the dirt, the trees, and our makeshift tents. Some boys joked and whispered, trying to make the most of the experience, but most of us were just eager to get some sleep. Then the sounds started. At first, it was faint, distant. A single whooping call carried across the night, something almost laugh-like, but stretched and unnatural. We all knew that sound. Hyenas, our teachers, sensing the immediate unease spreading through the group, assured us that we were safe. The national park was well fenced, they said. The hyenas were miles away, much farther than they sounded. Sound traveled differently in the open wilderness, and there was no reason to worry. They kept their voices calm, confident, but they weren't stupid. I noticed how they exchanged glances, how they stoked the fire, adding more wood, making sure it burned bigger and brighter. Despite their reassurances, sleep became impossible. Every few minutes, another call echoed in the distance. Then another, then another. They weren't so distant anymore. Lying there, staring up at the dark, open sky, I felt every inch of vulnerability settle in. There were no walls, no barriers, nothing between us and whatever was out there. The only thing keeping those animals at bay was the fire, and even that felt flimsy. The ground beneath me felt colder than before, the night stretching on endlessly. Every small rustle, every shift in the wind, made my heart pound harder. The sounds grew closer, not just one or two hyenas now, but many. The laughter-like calls circled us, moving in from all directions. The fire crackled loudly, its glow flickering against the trees, casting shifting, uncertain shapes. I tried to convince myself that it was fine, that our teachers knew what they were doing, that hyenas wouldn't come too close. But hyenas were different from other predators. Lions were feared, but they were regal, methodical. Hyenas had something wild about them. They were opportunist scavengers, but dangerous ones. They worked in packs, picking off the weak, wearing down their prey. And the way they sounded, it wasn't like any other animal. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was laughter, but not human, not comforting. It was sharp, rising and falling, carrying an unsettling intelligence, as if they knew something we didn't. Somewhere near the edge of the camp, a twig snapped. It could have been anything. A small animal, a shift in the ground, even just the heat of the fire making would expand. But in that moment, it felt like a warning. I lay frozen, listening, waiting for another sound, for proof of something moving just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. The calls continued, circling, closing in. The night felt impossibly long. I could hear others shifting in their sleeping bags, restless, awake despite the exhaustion. No one spoke, no one dared, and then suddenly silence.
No laughter.
No whooping calls, just the steady crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of the wind. It was somehow worse than the noise. At least when we could hear them, we knew where they were. The silence meant we didn't. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour, but it felt endless. My mind filled in the gaps, imagining eyes watching us from the darkness, bodies moving just beyond our sight. Every breath felt too loud. I wanted to move closer to the fire, but I didn't want to move at all. And then dawn. The first slivers of light crept over the horizon, casting a faint glow over the landscape. The fire had burned down but still smoldered, sending occasional embers into the air. Slowly, cautiously, people started moving, sitting up, stretching stiff limbs. There were no signs of anything having come into the camp. No tracks, no movement, but the tension in the air was thick. Somehow, we made it through the night. As the sun rose, we began our morning routine, shaking off the fear as best we could. The river, shallow and cool, seemed like a perfect way to refresh ourselves. Most of us splashed around near camp, the cold water waking us up. A few, along with one of the teachers, decided to go further downstream. They came back pale, unsettled. About 300 feet away, they had found a carcass. Fresh, a shredded mess of bones and flesh, picked apart with terrifying efficiency. Hyenas had been there, close. The teachers tried to downplay it, but we all knew what it meant. They had been nearby, possibly watching us the whole time, just waiting. Looking back, I'm glad I share that memory, that it's a story to tell. But at the time, in that moment, I wasn't thinking about stories. I was thinking about how thin the line was between safety and something else entirely. That night in the bush changed the way I thought about the wild. It wasn't just a backdrop to an adventure. It was real, alive, and we were just visitors passing through. I don't think any of us ever expected to end up in the newspaper. We were just a bunch of kids messing around, trying to get ready for the jamboree, not thinking about anything other than knots and campfires. But somehow, without meaning to, we left behind something that took on a life of its own. I still remember that campout like it was yesterday. Our Boy Scout troop had been given permission to camp on Old Man Komarek's land a few times before. It wasn't anything special, just a big stretch of dry, grassy fields with a few scattered trees and an old creek bed that only had water in it after a good rain. The Komarek family had owned the place forever, and the old man himself still lived there in a house that sat way off on the far side of the property, past the barbed wire fences and the dirt road. We never saw much of him. Sometimes we'd hear the rumble of his truck somewhere in the distance, but that was about it. It was a good place to camp, though. Plenty of space to spread out, no nosy neighbors to complain if we got too loud, and enough flat ground to set up all the gear we needed for practice. That's why we were out there, to work on lashing structures for the upcoming jamboree. Lashing was one of those things that was supposed to be fun, but usually just ended up being frustrating. We spent hours tying together sticks and poles to make all sorts of things. Tables, benches, flagpoles, and whatever else we could think of. Most of them never turned out quite right. Either the knots were too loose, or we didn't use the right kind of rope, or someone tied the wrong hitch and the whole thing collapsed. But one of the things we always got right was the tripod. The tripod was simple. 3 long poles lashed together at the top, with a crossbar hanging down so you could dangle a pot over a fire. We built at least one on every campout, mostly because it was useful. We set up a fire pit beneath it, kept a pot of water boiling most of the time, and sat around it whenever we weren't busy with other stuff. That weekend, though, something different happened. Someone, I don't remember who, wandered off and found an old cow skull lying in the grass. It wasn't all that surprising. The Komareks had run cattle on the land for years, and every now and then, one of them didn't make it. I'd seen a few bones out there before, usually ribs or leg bones dried and sun-bleached, but never a full skull. This one still had the horns on it. First, we just passed it around, looking at it. It was one of those things that seemed cool in the moment, but after a few minutes, nobody really knew what to do with it. A couple of guys talked about taking it home, but nobody wanted to carry it around, so it ended up sitting off to the side, forgotten. By the time we were breaking camp on the last day, most of us had already moved on, thinking about the drive home, what we'd be doing once we got back. That's probably why no one noticed when one of the younger kids, probably trying to be funny, took the skull and stuck it on top of the tripod. We were in a rush, trying to get everything packed up, so nobody gave it a second thought. The fire beneath the tripod had burned down to nothing but cold ashes. The whole setup just sat there, abandoned, as we loaded up our gear and headed back to town. And that was it. For us anyway. A month passed before any of us thought about that trip again. I was at home when my dad walked in, tossing the newspaper onto the kitchen table. The front page didn't catch my eye at first. Some story about road construction. But then my dad flipped it over, revealing a black and white photo on the bottom half of the page. Even now, I can still see it in my head. The grainy image of the tripod, standing alone in the middle of an empty field, the cow skull perched on top like some kind of grim trophy. The article beside it had a headline that read something along the lines of "Satanic ritual site discovered on local ranch," or something equally ridiculous. Apparently, Old Man Komarek had come across it while checking his property. He must have been out there with his truck, driving the fence line, when he saw the strange setup. Maybe he got spooked. Maybe he was just pissed off. But whatever he thought, he didn't keep it to himself. The article mentioned that he'd called the sheriff's office, who in turn had alerted the local paper. The story was exactly what you'd expect. Talk of devil worshippers, speculation about teenagers sneaking onto private land, vague mentions of past incidents that probably never happened. There was even a quote from someone claiming they'd heard weird noises at night near the ranch, like chanting. It was all nonsense, but that didn't stop people from eating it up. At school, the story spread like wildfire. Nobody ever connected it to us, though. None of the guys in our troop said a word. Whether it was out of embarrassment or just the thrill of keeping a secret, nobody owned up to it. It didn't take long for the place to become a legend. Over the next few years, Old Man Komarek's land became one of those places people whispered about. High school kids dared each other to go out there at night. Some claimed they saw strange lights. Others said they heard voices. A couple of guys swore they saw figures moving around near the spot where the tripod had been. Of course, it was all nonsense. The reality was simple. We were just a bunch of scouts who lashed together a cooking tripod and left a cow skull on it. That was it. There was no ceremony, no ritual, no devil worshippers creeping around in the night. But that didn't matter. The story had taken on a life of its own. Eventually, Komarek's land changed hands. The old man passed away, and someone else bought the property. Last I heard, they fenced off a big portion of it and put up no trespassing signs to keep people out. Maybe they were sick of teenagers sneaking onto the land, looking for ghosts. Maybe they just wanted some privacy. Either way, I doubt anybody would ever know the truth. It's funny, looking back on it now. We never meant to create a legend. We never thought we were doing anything strange or creepy. But somehow, a simple accident, a joke, really turned into something bigger than any of us. And as far as I know, none of us ever told a soul. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to head up to the abandoned zoo in Los Angeles. There were 7 of us total, all of us hungry for something thrilling, something that would really get our adrenaline pumping. We were all about the idea of getting scared shitless, but none of us expected it to feel so real. The zoo itself had been closed for decades, but there was still something oddly compelling about it. The way its history lingered in the air, the feeling that something was still out there, even though everything was supposed to be abandoned. We'd done our homework. We knew it was an old, rundown spot, but it had this eerie pull that none of us could resist. The hike up to the zoo wasn't easy. We'd started a little after sundown, knowing it'd be dark by the time we reached the old site. Took about 2 hours to get to the top, a good chunk of that time spent navigating through a canyon. The first half was pretty uneventful, just the usual night creatures stirring around. A few small animals darting through the brush, some owls hooting in the distance, but nothing that really raised the hairs on the back of our necks. To be honest, we were all too busy joking around, making fun of each other, trying to hype ourselves up for whatever creepy things we thought we might find up there. But when we got to the 3/4 mark, things started to shift. The trail up ahead became noticeably more narrow. At first, it was just a slight tightness, but as we continued, the path got thinner and thinner until we were essentially walking sideways, barely able to fit through the space. It was that kind of trail where you can't help but press your back against the canyon wall to avoid slipping off into the abyss. The last part of the hike was a single-file affair, and we were all following each other close, trying to keep our balance as best we could. As we moved, the air seemed to shift. The sound of crickets and rustling leaves seemed distant, swallowed up by the walls of the canyon. I didn't really think too much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for the atmosphere to change in a place like this, especially as we neared the zoo. But then the flashlights started flickering. It wasn't sudden. First, it was just a brief blink, like a stutter in the beam, then another, and then, after a few more flickers, my light started to give out completely. I checked the batteries, fresh ones before we left, or so I thought. My friends were dealing with the same issue, their beams weakening one by one. Great, I thought. Of course this happens now. It wasn't a big deal at first. It was still a little light out, and we had our phone lights to fall back on, so no one was overly concerned. We all kept moving, taking the narrow path in silence for the most part. just listening to the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustle in the bushes around us. But then the guy in the front, Brian, stopped. He didn't say anything. He just froze, looking ahead, staring at something. "Brian," someone called from behind him. "What's up?" He didn't respond. We were all starting to get annoyed, wondering if he was just trying to scare us. But then I saw it too. It didn't take long. About 2 seconds after Brian stopped, I saw what he was staring at, and my heart stopped right along with him. A man, dressed in all white. Not a regular white shirt and pants, though. This guy looked like something out of an old Western film, but with a twist. His clothes were crisp and clean, almost unnaturally so, considering how overgrown and wild the area was. His white hair matched his outfit, and he was wearing a white top hat. He looked like an old cowboy, but something was wrong. There was no dust on him. No sign that he'd been traveling or walking through the rough terrain with us. In fact, the way he moved made it seem like he didn't care about the narrow path we were on. He walked through us like we weren't even there, and it wasn't like he was in a hurry or trying to pass by quickly. No, he just strolled through the tight passage, like it was a normal part of his day. We were all pressed against the canyon wall, trying to make ourselves as small as possible, just watching him walk past. His face hidden under a cloth, his steps deliberate. Couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. How could someone be out here? Why was he dressed like that? Was this some kind of weird prank? Or was he just lost like us, trying to get to the zoo? But if he was lost, how did he know exactly where to go? And why wasn't he reacting to us at all? I wanted to scream. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, watching this man move through our group with no care, no hesitation. As he passed me, I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl up my spine. There was something about the way he moved that wasn't right. He wasn't stumbling like someone lost or confused in the wilderness. No, he was confident. And when he got past us, his eyes, hidden beneath the cloth, felt like they were still on me, watching me even though I couldn't see them. The guy in the front finally snapped out of his trance and turned to us. "Okay, that's enough. We're going back," he said, his voice shaky. None of us argued. We didn't need to. I think we all knew deep down that we had to get out of there. Felt wrong. So we turned around, every one of us looking over our shoulders, half expecting the man in white to come after us. But he didn't. There was nothing, just the same eerie silence. The hike down wasn't nearly as bad as the way up. Maybe it was because we were all so shaken that we moved faster, or maybe it was just the relief of putting distance between ourselves and whatever we'd seen. The canyon seemed less oppressive as we retraced our steps, but even then, it didn't feel like we were alone. There were the sounds again, the rustling in the brush, the occasional heavy breath, as though something or someone was following us. We didn't talk much on the way back. It was all about getting to the car, getting out. When we finally made it back to our car, we were breathing easier, but there was still a sense of unease hanging in the air. We piled in, laughing nervously, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to us. But that's when we saw them. Orbs. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the headlights reflecting off something, but no. These were orbs, small, bright, and fast, circling around our car. I could see them through the windshield, zipping around in erratic patterns, almost like they were playing. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't right. "Hey, you see that?" someone asked, his voice tense. Before anyone could answer, the orbs vanished. Just like that. 1 second they were there, and the next, nothing. We sat there in stunned silence for a minute, each of us trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. But nothing made sense. We weren't in a hurry to talk about it. We didn't want to. We didn't want to give voice to whatever had just happened. Eventually, we drove off, heading back to the city. None of us spoke much on the way down the mountain, but we all knew. We all felt it. Whatever had been up there wasn't just part of some urban legend or campfire tale. We had seen something that shouldn't have been there, and I'm sure none of us would ever be going back. I had never really believed in UFOs. Sure, I'd heard all the stories, and there was the occasional YouTube video floating around showing some strange lights or bizarre shapes, but I always chalked them up to something explainable, maybe a satellite or some fancy drone work. But when I found out that the MT Adams area had a reputation for weird sightings, I thought it might be worth testing the waters. My boyfriend, Ryan, was a skeptic through and through. He wasn't the kind of guy who even entertained conspiracy theories or strange phenomena. He liked things logical, orderly, and well, predictable. The perfect guy to bring along for my first camping trip to a place known for its strange lights in the sky. We hadn't been dating for long, but this trip felt like a test. I wanted to see if he could keep his mind open, or at least be willing to entertain the possibility that there was more to this world than he could explain with his usual "it's just science" approach. So I convinced him to come with me. We set up camp at a dispersed spot near the forest, surrounded by towering trees that stretched up into the dimming sky. The air was cool, but not too cold, and everything about the place felt wild and remote. This was the kind of spot you could get lost in if you weren't careful. The evening went on like any other, setting up camp, gathering firewood, and chatting casually about anything and everything. I tried not to bring up the topic of UFOs too much, not wanting to push him too hard, but it was hard to ignore the fact that we were sitting in the heart of a well-known UFO hotspot. I'd heard all sorts of stories from locals, mostly about strange lights darting across the sky in ways that defied explanation. There were rumors about military testing, secret government operations, and some even said the lights were connected to ancient Native American lore. But I didn't believe in all that nonsense. I just wanted to see the lights myself, maybe even snap a photo for proof. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky darkened, and the first stars began to blink into view. Ryan was lounging by the fire, roasting marshmallows, and I was scanning the sky. I had heard stories of strange occurrences in this area, and as much as I wanted to be open-minded, I couldn't help but feel a little skeptical too. Nothing happened for a while, just the usual sounds of the forest settling in for the night. But then it started. First, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. A light flickered in the distance, way off past the tree line. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible glow at first. I squinted, and then it was gone. I looked over at Ryan. He hadn't noticed anything. I didn't say anything, thinking I was just imagining things. But then it happened again. This time, the light grew brighter, appearing out of nowhere and zipping across the sky. It wasn't like any plane or helicopter I'd ever seen. It moved with speed and precision that didn't seem humanly possible. It darted behind a mountain and disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. My heart started to race, but I didn't want to freak out in front of Ryan. I wasn't sure what he'd think. "Did you see that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, his face blank. "See what?" I bit my lip, unsure whether to push it. But then, just as I was about to say something else, I saw it again. This time, two lights appeared, moving closer together and forming a triangular shape. The lights merged and separated, like they were dancing in the sky, weaving around each other in ways that made no sense. I could feel my heart pounding now. This was no helicopter, no plane, no drone. These lights were something else entirely. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone to snap a picture, but before I could, the lights were gone. "Okay, that was weird," Ryan said, finally breaking his silence. He leaned forward, squinting into the sky. "What was that?" I was shocked. He didn't try to explain it away immediately. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I've heard this happens around here. People say it's UFOs." Ryan rubbed his forehead, looking genuinely puzzled. "I don't know what that was, but it wasn't like any plane or satellite I've ever seen." I smiled to myself, a feeling of satisfaction washing over me. This was exactly the kind of reaction I had hoped for. Yeah, I have no idea what that was either. The rest of the night was quiet, though my mind kept replaying the lights. Even Ryan seemed a bit unsettled, his usual skepticism now laced with doubt. It felt good to have my own experience validated, even if it hadn't fully convinced him. But what really got me was the way he couldn't dismiss it. There was something about the way he'd said, "I don't know," that told me he was reconsidering what he thought he knew. A few months later, we went camping again, but this time with Ryan's dad and stepdad, both of whom had spent decades working for the Forest Service and BLM. These two guys were the epitome of no-nonsense, practical, and level-headed. If anyone would have an explanation for strange occurrences in the forest, it would be them. We were sitting around the campfire, sharing stories and catching up, when I casually mentioned the spot near MT Adams where we'd camped and the lights we'd seen. His stepdad, who had always been the most grounded, unflappable guy I'd ever met, didn't react the way I expected. He didn't laugh or make some sarcastic remark. Instead, he just stared into the fire for a long time, his expression unreadable. "I used to patrol that area," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of something I couldn't quite place. "Gifford Pinchot National Forest. I was up there for years, looking for camp thieves." I looked at Ryan, who was just as curious now as I was. "Really?" I asked, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. "What's the story with that area? I've heard some weird things about the sky around there." His stepdad was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "We never caught any thieves, but we saw a lot of weird stuff in the sky." I felt my pulse quicken. Ryan shifted in his seat, clearly intrigued now, but his dad remained as stoic as ever. I pressed him for more details, though I knew he was holding something back. He didn't seem eager to share, but eventually he gave in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There were these big, black logging trucks," he began.
No lights, no noise.
They'd show up in the middle of the night and steal lumber, and they were good at it. Too good. I leaned in, trying to absorb every word. "What did you do?" "We staked them out one night," he said, his eyes distant now, like he was reliving the moment. "My partner and I backed into the bush, kept the engine off, sat in complete silence. We had to wait for the truck to cool down so the heat signature wouldn't give us away. We were deep in the forest, nothing behind us but trees and more trees. We waited for hours. The air was still, and the silence felt like it was closing in on us." He paused, his gaze fixed on something only he could see in the distance. "Then, from deep in the forest, we saw them," he continued. "Bright lights, huge lights, so bright they lit up the entire truck. Spotlights, antennas, everything. And it wasn't just one light. It was a whole cluster hovering behind us. I've never seen anything like it. The lights were so bright, it was like they were turning night into day. And then, just as quickly as they came, they went out. The truck, gone.
No noise.
No truck rumble, no tires on gravel. Just silence." I could see that his stepdad wasn't making this up. His voice shook slightly as he finished the story. I had never heard him sound so unmoored before. Ryan was quiet for a long time, clearly trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. The fire crackled in the background, but all I could think about was the utter certainty in his stepdad's voice. This wasn't a story that had been cooked up or exaggerated. He wasn't the type, and there was no way that he had imagined what he saw. I didn't say anything. I think we were both processing the same thing. There was no explanation for what had happened in that forest, and maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. Ryan's stepdad didn't offer any more details, and the rest of the night passed quietly. But I couldn't stop thinking about his story. I had heard about weird things in the Gifford Pinchot area, but hearing it from someone who had spent years working there, someone who wasn't prone to exaggeration, it hit different. There were no easy explanations, just like the lights Ryan and I had seen months ago. I'd come to realize that sometimes there were things in this world that didn't fit neatly into a box, no matter how much we tried to explain them away. By the end of that trip, Ryan didn't bring up the lights again, but he didn't dismiss the possibility of something strange happening either. There was just a quiet acknowledgement between us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers, and maybe that's okay. But as we packed up our gear and headed out of the woods, I couldn't help but look up at the sky, just in case. The sun was blistering hot, and my buddy Chris and I, 18 years old and freshly graduated from high school, were standing at the trailhead of the Tanner Trail at the Grand Canyon. We dreamed of this trip for years, imagining how epic it would be to hike down into the canyon and see the Colorado River up close. We thought we were invincible. We trained a little, read some books, and talked to a few older hikers, but honestly, we were underprepared for the magnitude of what we'd signed up for. The trail was known for its difficulty, but that was the kind of challenge we wanted. High school was behind us, and we were ready to conquer something big. In late June, the temperature was already pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit at the rim, and we still had hours to go before reaching the bottom. The heat only got worse as we descended, the air growing thicker and heavier with every step. The trail was steep, and the dry, cracked earth beneath our boots seemed to suck the moisture from our bodies. We were carrying the bare minimum: water, some food, and our sleeping bags. We didn't have much else. Our focus was on finishing the hike, reaching the river, and surviving the desert heat. As the sun beat down on us, the sweat soaked our shirts, and we could feel the dry air coating our throats. Every time we stopped for a break, we drank as much water as we could, trying to keep our bodies from shutting down. I had read about people dying from heat stroke in the canyon, but I thought that was something that happened to other people who didn't prepare, people who were dumb. But even though I kept telling myself that, I couldn't ignore how rough the hike was. The trail was unforgiving, the relentless sun unforgiving, and by the time we made it to the bottom, we were both wiped out. The Grand Canyon is massive, so much bigger than I'd ever imagined. It's a place that's as beautiful as it is brutal. Standing at the bottom, looking up at the canyon walls, you realize how small you are, how insignificant. We reached the Colorado River just as the sun was starting to dip below the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the dry creek bed that led to the water. I had never been so thirsty in my life. We'd gone through nearly all of our water on the way down, and the river was a welcome sight. The only problem was that we were so damn tired, we didn't really have the energy to set up camp properly. We rounded a few boulders and saw the river up ahead. It was wide and slow, the water shimmering with a reddish hue as the last rays of the sun hit the surface. It looked almost surreal. The moment we stepped closer to the river, I noticed something strange. There was a man standing at the water's edge. He didn't seem to notice us at first, and we didn't really think much of it. It wasn't like there were many people around. Hell, we hadn't seen another soul on the trail for hours. The only other people we'd seen that day were a couple of hikers who had passed us on the way down. But that was hours ago. So to come across someone here, at the very bottom of the canyon, was unexpected. At first glance, the man looked pretty typical, a little out of place, but then again, we were out of place too. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, with long black hair that hung down past his shoulders. He wore a denim shirt, tucked into a pair of jeans, and a pair of old boots. He looked like someone who could have stepped straight out of an old Western movie, like Lou Diamond Phillips in Young Guns. It was odd, considering the place we were in, This was the Grand Canyon, and here was this guy just standing there like he didn't have a care in the world. We walked closer, and I noticed he was staring at the river, but he wasn't doing anything that made sense to me. He was tossing something into the water, but not a rock or a stick like most people would do. It was a racquetball, a bright green racquetball of all things, that he was throwing into the fast-moving rapids at the foot of the creek. I watched as it traveled downstream, bouncing and skipping over the surface of the water for maybe 8 or 10 feet before it hit a rock and came back toward him. I didn't say anything at first. Chris didn't either. We were both too tired, too overheated to think much about it. The sight of this man, throwing a racquetball into the river as if it were the most normal thing in the world, didn't really hit us until later. We were just trying to get through the day. "Hey," I finally said, my voice hoarse from the heat. "How's it going?" He turned toward us, nodding. "Hi," he said simply, his voice calm and low, almost like he was in some sort of trance. He didn't seem surprised to see us, or curious, or even really interested. He just seemed spaced out, maybe tired too. We were all pretty drained by then. We didn't want to bother him, and we were both desperate to find a spot to camp for the night. So we just nodded back and started walking upstream, keeping our distance. The man didn't say anything more, and as we walked past him, he started walking downstream, still tossing the racquetball into the river. After a minute or so, we lost sight of him, and it wasn't until much later that we realized how weird the whole situation had been. We set up camp a little ways upstream from where we'd seen him, but we didn't sleep well that night. The heat was still intense, and the air felt thick and stagnant, as if the canyon was holding us in a vice grip. We had a little food left, but we were both too tired to eat much, so we just sat by the fire and stared into the flames, trying to ignore the weird feeling that was creeping up on us. We didn't talk much. We didn't really need to. We were both thinking the same thing. How the hell had that guy known to throw a racquetball into the water like that? It didn't make sense. The river was fast-moving, and the water was cold, but the way the ball bounced back to him, like he was reading the currents, knowing exactly where to throw it, was strange. I had never seen anything like it before. It was almost as if he'd done it 1,000 times, like he knew the river in a way that no one else could. I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the weirder it seemed. We hadn't seen another hiker all day, and here was this guy out of nowhere doing something so precise. It didn't feel right. There was no way he could have been a local, right? I mean, who in their right mind would be out there by themselves in the middle of nowhere just tossing a racquetball into the rapids? And why the hell didn't he even acknowledge us when we walked up? He just seemed disconnected, like he was in his own world. The night passed slowly, with the sounds of the river running in the background and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I kept imagining what would have happened if we had stayed to talk to the man longer. Would he have given us some cryptic warning about the canyon? Would he have told us to leave, to go back up to the rim before it was too late? There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, like he wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, we packed up our camp and started the long hike back up to the rim, trying not to think too much about the man we'd encountered. But the weird feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Had we just met a random guy who was also out in the canyon, or had we stumbled across something else? Something that didn't quite add up? In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. It wasn't the man's appearance that bothered me, or even his behavior. It was the feeling of isolation, the strange disconnect between us and him, like we weren't meant to be there. I couldn't stop wondering about how he knew about the currents, how he seemed so at home in that place. What had he been doing out there? Was he just some guy lost in the canyon? Or was there something more to it? I don't know if we'll ever know the truth. What I do know is this: when we finally made it back to the top of the canyon and looked down at the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that place than just a beautiful landscape. There were secrets hidden in those rocks, in those rapids, and the man we met with his strange practiced throw might have known more about them than anyone else. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that place, but one thing's for sure. The Grand Canyon has a way of making you feel small and insignificant, and sometimes it's not the beauty that stays with you. It's the questions that never get answered. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. A group of friends, a weekend away from the noise of everyday life, just a chance to unplug and enjoy nature. We picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from any kind of civilization. The kind of place where cell phones didn't get a signal, where the air was so fresh it felt like it was clearing out your lungs, and the only sounds were birds, wind, and the rustling of leaves. We were seasoned campers, used to roughing it, used to hiking long distances, setting up tents, and cooking meals over a fire. But none of us could have predicted what would happen when we ventured into those woods. It started as a typical Friday evening. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset, the sky painted in deep shades of orange and purple. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional bird call. The air was cool, but not cold enough to need jackets yet. The ground was soft with a thick layer of fallen leaves, and the smell of pine hung in the air. We set up camp without much trouble, setting up our tents in a clearing near a small stream that trickled through the woods. We built a fire, made some dinner, and sat around it, talking about everything and nothing at all. As night began to settle in, we all sat around the fire, each of us content in the stillness of the woods. There was something peaceful about it. The way the shadows moved as the fire flickered, the way the night felt safe, like we were in our own little world, far removed from the busy cities we'd left behind. We had everything we needed: food, fire, company. But something was off. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It was just a feeling, like a faint whisper that you couldn't quite place. I brushed it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a campfire, a few friends, and a nice night in the woods. But as the hours passed, that feeling grew, and I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone out there. Around 10 p.m., we decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were quieter now. We said our goodnights, and each of us retreated to our tents. I crawled into mine, zipping up the door and settling into my sleeping bag. The forest was so still, I could hear every tiny sound: the wind whispering through the trees, the distant call of a night bird, the rustling of a small animal in the underbrush. It wasn't long before I started to drift off, the quiet of the night wrapping around me like a blanket. But then, something caught my ear. A noise, faint but clear. A twig snapping. It came from the woods behind our campsite, somewhere beyond the tree line. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, louder this time, closer to the tent. My heart started to race, and I sat up, straining to listen. There was something wrong about that noise. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded deliberate, almost as if someone was walking through the woods, careful and slow. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to acknowledge that someone could be out there, but the feeling in my gut was undeniable. The quiet that had filled the night before was gone, replaced by the unsettling sound of movement in the woods. I held my breath, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. What was it? Could it be someone else camping nearby? But no one else had set up camp that far into the woods, and certainly no one would be out here at this time of night. The noise stopped for a few minutes, and I convinced myself I was being paranoid. But then it started again, this time closer. I heard the distinct crunch of leaves and twigs, followed by heavy breathing, slow and measured, like whoever it was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. My hands were clammy as I reached for my flashlight. I tried to turn it on, but my fingers were shaking so much that it took a few tries. When the beam of light flickered to life, I shined it through the mesh of the tent, scanning the area around our camp. Nothing. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was probably just an animal. The woods were full of them, after all. But then, just as I was about to close my eyes again, I heard it, a low growl. It was faint, but clear enough that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A growl. That wasn't any animal I knew. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A cougar? I didn't know, but I knew it wasn't good. I lay there, too terrified to move, my flashlight now gripped tightly in my hands. I couldn't hear anything else over the pounding of my own heart. The growl came again, closer this time. It was deep, throaty, almost like a warning. Whoever or whatever was out there, it knew we were here. I wanted to call out to the others, but my voice wouldn't work. It felt like the whole forest had gone quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. The only sound was that low, guttural growl. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I heard the crunch of footsteps again, but this time they were retreating. Whoever or whatever was out there had decided to leave. The growl faded, and for the first time that night, the woods felt quiet again. I waited a few more minutes, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to call out, to warn the others, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, exhaustion overpowering my fear. The night passed uneventfully after that, and when I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft light over the forest. The woods were peaceful once again, birds chirping in the trees, the sound of the stream flowing nearby. But I didn't feel at peace. I couldn't forget the growl, the feeling that we weren't alone out there. When I stepped out of the tent, I saw the others already awake, sitting around the fire. They didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. They hadn't heard the sounds, hadn't felt the unease I had. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I'd just been imagining things. But the doubt lingered. Later that morning, we went for a hike, following the trail that wound deeper into the woods. The forest was still beautiful, but now I felt a sense of caution in every step I took. The air felt different, heavier, as though the woods were watching us. We reached the edge of a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. There, in the dirt, were tracks. Large tracks, too large for any animal I knew. They weren't human, but they didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in the woods. The ground was soft, and the tracks were still fresh, the edges clearly defined. They were wide, almost like something with big paws, maybe a bear, but these tracks didn't quite match any bear prints I had seen before. I bent down to examine them, my heart racing. They were too large for a normal bear, and the shape wasn't right. There was something about them that didn't sit right with me. The air around us felt tense, like the woods were holding its breath. We turned back to camp, the unease still gnawing at the back of my mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We went through the motions, ate, hiked a little, joked around, but something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. That night, we packed up earlier than planned. No one else seemed to notice the strange energy in the air, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. We left the woods before the sun set, the sounds of the forest fading into the distance as we drove away. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that the woods weren't finished with us. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and I don't think we were meant to leave unscathed. We were camping in Okanagan Falls, a small town in British Columbia, Canada, just a short drive away from my hometown. I was 12 at the time, and the trip was meant to be a fun celebration for my 13th birthday. My friends and I had been looking forward to this all summer. We had the whole weekend planned out, with swimming, hiking, and marshmallows over the campfire. It was the perfect getaway, or so we thought. The morning had been perfect. It was sunny, and the air smelled fresh, full of pine and the earthy scent of the forest. The lake was calm, and we spent hours swimming, laughing, and making the most of the day. But as the sun started to dip lower in the sky, the light shifted, and the shadows of the trees grew longer. We decided it was time to head back to our campsite, and we started walking along the path that ran parallel to the river. The river was fast, flowing strongly over smooth rocks, and it led to a dam about a mile down the way. The dam had a notorious reputation in the area. A few years ago, 2 young brothers had drowned in the river. They'd been swimming near the dam, and from what we'd heard on the news, they had gotten too close to the turbines. They couldn't escape. The town had put up signs and even marked the dam with a skull and crossbones to warn others. But something about it seemed even more ominous when you stood there on the riverbank. I had heard the stories, of course. Everybody in town had. It was tragic, and it left a heavy feeling in the air around the river. We tried to shake off the somber thoughts, but it was hard not to think about it. We were walking about a couple hundred meters down the river when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The river was still, with only the occasional ripple from the current. But then I saw it more clearly. A figure standing in the middle of the river. It wasn't a person standing at the river's edge like you'd expect. No, this was something different. A boy, seemingly about my age, but what caught my attention was that he was walking on top of the water. The boy was strangely clear in the dimming light, almost glowing. His form wasn't solid in the way you'd expect a real person to be, but it wasn't transparent either. It was as though he existed, but in a different way. He was pale, with a portly frame, and dressed in clothes that I couldn't quite make out. His image was bright, unnaturally bright, against the darkening backdrop of the river and trees. His movement was slow and deliberate, his feet never seeming to break the surface of the water as he walked along the current, seemingly without effort. I froze, not sure whether I was seeing things or if something strange was really happening. My heart skipped a beat as I looked back at my friends. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to scare anyone, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. One of my friends, Julia, turned and squinted at the figure. For a moment, she was silent, just staring. Then she looked at me wide-eyed. "I see it too," she said, her voice trembling. Her face turned pale, but she didn't look away. "What is that?" The other friend, Emily, was already covering her face with her hands, a nervous laugh escaping her. "I'm not looking. Nope, I'm too scared." She turned her head down, walking faster toward the camp. Julia and I stayed where we were, transfixed by the boy on the water. There was something incredibly odd about it. The water beneath him didn't disturb as it should have. The current didn't seem to affect his steps, and he walked as though it was solid ground. His movements were slow and measured, like he was walking casually along a familiar path. It didn't seem real. How could someone walk on water? It just didn't make sense. For a few moments, all I could hear was the distant murmur of the river and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The figure walked along the water's surface, not in any hurry. The sun had almost set now, and the shadows from the trees stretched across the river, making everything feel a bit more unreal, more dreamlike. The figure, this boy, continued moving until he was about 10 meters away from us. Then, without any warning, he simply faded from view. His body began to blur and disappear, as though he was never there at all. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the evening air. I felt an odd mix of emotions, none of which I could fully understand. There was awe, a bit of fear, and confusion. I looked at Julia, who was now visibly shaken. She was staring at the place where the boy had been, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Neither of us spoke for a few moments. There didn't seem to be anything to say. We both knew what we had just seen, and there was no way to explain it logically. Finally, Julia broke the silence. That wasn't normal, was it?" she asked quietly, her voice unsure. "No," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. That was definitely not normal. We both stood there for a few moments longer, both too stunned to speak. It wasn't until the last sliver of sunlight disappeared that we turned and started walking back toward the campground, both of us in silence. We didn't talk about what we had seen, not until later, when we were safely back in our tents, surrounded by the warmth of the campfire. That night, I kept thinking about the boy, and I couldn't shake the image of him walking on the water. It was so clear, so vivid. I knew what I saw, but I didn't know what it meant. My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing seemed to fit. It wasn't like anything I had read or heard about, nothing I could explain with logic or reason. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling restless. The lake was calm as usual, and the river beside our campsite flowed steadily. But the unease from the night before lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to brush it off, but every time I looked toward the river, my mind would drift back to that strange, white figure on the water. We packed up and left the campground a couple of hours later, but the strange encounter still weighed on me. I couldn't talk to my friends about it again, not directly. I wasn't sure if they had seen what I had seen. Julia didn't bring it up again, and Emily, still frightened from the previous night, seemed to focus on anything but the river. I've thought about that moment many times over the years. The boy on the water. It wasn't a ghost, not in the sense of a traditional haunting. There was nothing otherworldly in the way he moved. No eerie chill in the air, no unnatural sounds. Just a figure, walking on the water, slowly, calmly, as though it belonged there. It wasn't something I could easily explain, and to this day, it remains the most inexplicable thing I've ever experienced. It wasn't the typical kind of paranormal encounter people talk about. No haunting, no spirits, but it still left me with an unsettling feeling that stayed with me long after we left Okanagan Falls. As I grew older, I learned more about the river and the dam and the tragic story of the brothers. It gave me a new perspective on what I had seen that day, though I still couldn't explain it. But in some way, I didn't need an explanation. I just knew what I saw, and that was enough for me. Sometimes, the strangest experiences don't need to be understood. They just are. And that's the most incredible part of it all. I remember it like it was just yesterday, though it happened over 40 years ago. It was one of those experiences that stuck with me, a creeping unease that has lingered even after all this time. The kind of feeling that makes you question whether it was all in your head or if there was something real to be afraid of. We were in Northern California, in a secluded campground surrounded by towering trees. The place was tucked away, the kind of place where you can get lost in your thoughts and in the woods. It wasn't a busy spot, not like the big campgrounds you'd see during summer weekends, but rather a quiet, more hidden place. The trees around us stretched high, their shadows making the whole area feel almost timeless. It was late afternoon, and the sky was overcast, a blanket of gray casting everything in a muted light. My cousin and I had decided to explore a little. We were both in our early teens at the time, the kind of age where everything seems like an adventure, but at the same time you still have that youthful sense of wonder, and just enough fear to keep you from pushing too far. We wandered down a narrow, winding path that cut through the trees, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles. It was quiet, so quiet you could hear the subtle crunch of the needles beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. There was something peaceful about it, but that feeling of calm soon gave way to something else, something unsettling. The path opened up into a clearing, not quite a meadow, but a patch of land where the trees had been cleared. The edges were lined with the remains of older growth, dead trees and fallen branches. It wasn't a wide clearing, maybe about 20 feet across, but it felt out of place. The air was thicker here, almost as if it was holding something in. Right in the middle of this clearing, there was a structure that caught my eye. It was old, weathered, and looked like it had been standing for a long time. A corral made of thick, heavy logs, arranged in a circle. The logs were crooked and decayed, gray with age, some of them half sunken into the ground. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were no animals in it, nothing to indicate that it had been used for its original purpose. Just a silent ring of wood in the middle of nowhere. My cousin and I walked up to it, curious. We climbed onto the logs and sat at the edge, our legs dangling over the side. It was strangely peaceful up there, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the silence or the way the trees seemed to close in around us, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. As we sat there, we noticed something strange inside the corral. In the very center, tucked away against one of the logs, was a small shelter. It was made from twigs and branches, arranged in a rough rectangle. It wasn't very tall, maybe 3 feet high, and the roof was sagging, the branches held together by what looked like natural twine. There was only one entrance, and it was facing us. I could see that it was deep, but the inside was too dark to make out anything specific. It felt like the shadows inside swallowed whatever might have been there, but it was the smell that made me pause. As we looked closer, I noticed something near the entrance to the shelter. Feces, not animal droppings like you'd expect from a small creature, but something bigger. The piles were fresh, fairly recent, and there were more than one. 2 others, maybe 2 feet from the shelter, scattered on the ground. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't feel right. The whole scene was too off. What really struck me, though, was the corral itself. There was no gate, no way to get in or out without climbing over the logs. If you were going to get to that shelter, you would have to climb inside the circle, just like we had. There was no other way in. And yet, there it was, that strange shelter, tucked away as if it had been placed there deliberately. I didn't want to be there anymore. My stomach twisted, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt heavier now, like something was watching us, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I turned my head, trying to catch a glimpse of something in the trees, but all I could see were the dark trunks of the pines and the occasional flicker of movement in the underbrush. It was too quiet, too still. My mind was racing, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong. My cousin, who had been talking about climbing up to the top of the shelter, stopped when he saw the look on my face. I didn't even have to say anything. He must have felt it too. The same dread that had settled in my gut seemed to have wrapped itself around him as well. We didn't say a word, but we both knew it was time to leave. I don't remember how we got back to the campground, but we didn't waste any time. We didn't look back. We didn't talk to each other as we walked, but the silence between us was heavier than any words could have been. I remember the weight of the forest around us, the feeling that something had followed us, that it was still there, just beyond our sight. Every rustle in the trees made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time we made it back to the campground, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was growing darker. The air was cooler now, and the feeling of dread had followed us back. I could still picture that shelter in my mind, the dark entrance, the strange piles of scat around it, and the sense that we were intruders in a place we shouldn't have been. It wasn't until much later that I learned the area had been used by ranchers years ago, long before the campground had been established. I didn't go back to that spot for years. The memory stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the shelter or the strange feeling I had. It was the thought that we were never truly alone in that forest. Something had been there, watching, waiting. To this day, I can't explain what happened that afternoon, but I know this. There are places in the woods that are better left unexplored, and some things are better left undisturbed. There's a certain kind of silence in the deep woods, a stillness that makes you realize you're not alone. And when that feeling hits, you can't help but wonder if you've just walked into something you weren't meant to find. When I was younger, my family owned a small camp deep in the outskirts of Powers, Michigan. The place was isolated, just a hand-built log cabin tucked into the forest with no indoor plumbing, no electricity, nothing. It wasn't a vacation spot for relaxation. It was mostly used for hunting trips and weekends away from the distractions of everyday life. My dad, though, decided that this year we'd spend our spring break there. It seemed like a fun idea at the time, just the four of us. My dad, my sister, me, and our dog, Buster. A week in the woods away from everyone else. Felt like an adventure. The cabin was cozy, but it was rough around the edges. The logs creaked every time the wind blew. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and there was always a cold draft. The only source of light at night came from a single lantern or the faint glow of the generator my dad would fire up every evening. There wasn't much else out there, except for trees, wildlife, and miles of unbroken silence. The stillness was deafening when the generator was turned off. The first couple of nights were uneventful. We all settled in pretty well. My sister and dad were great sleepers, always out like a light once their heads hit the pillows. But for me, the quiet was too much. I'd lie there in my bed, feeling the cold seep in from the cracks in the walls, listening to the wind howling outside. It was around 2008, so I had my trusty iPod Nano with me. Remember those? And I'd play games or listen to music until I felt like I was finally drifting off to sleep. It was the third night that something happened that I still can't explain. Even now, I had just gotten comfortable, the noise of my sister and dad snoring filling the room. They snored loudly, so loudly it felt like the walls might cave in. The only thing I could focus on was the rhythmic hum of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin. The steady pulse of the wind seemed to lull me into a haze, and soon I felt my eyelids getting heavy. But just as I was starting to drift off, a noise jerked me awake. At first, it was subtle, just a faint buzzing sound, almost like an insect flying too close to my ear. But then it grew louder, vibrating through the cabin, rattling the walls around me. It wasn't like any insect noise I'd ever heard. It sounded more mechanical, like something much bigger, much more unnatural. My heart started to race. I sat up in bed and glanced around the room, but my eyes were drawn to the skylight above. The buzzing was getting louder and louder, and the walls were shaking from the intensity of it. I had no idea what was going on. Was it some kind of animal? No, the sound didn't fit. Was it the wind? No, that didn't make sense either. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe I was still half asleep. But as I stared harder, I realized I wasn't imagining things. The skylight above me, which had been empty moments before, was now covered with an explosion of colors. I saw a flash of vibrant greens, reds, blues, like the sky had torn open. It wasn't like any natural light I'd ever seen, either. It reminded me of the way a transformer explodes, those flashes of rainbow light that fill the sky in a chaotic burst. Only this wasn't a flash. This was a constant, pulsing light that was expanding rapidly, like it was getting closer. It was completely filling the skylight, and it seemed to be moving toward me, toward the cabin. My heart was pounding now. I tried to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. There was no electricity in the cabin, and we hadn't heard any aircraft overhead. The generator was off, and even if it wasn't, there was no reason for a light like that. The buzzing noise was so loud now that it felt like it was inside my head. I could feel the vibrations in my teeth, in my chest. The light was getting brighter, and the buzz was almost unbearable. I scrambled for a pillow, hoping it would block out the noise, but it didn't help. Panicked, I looked to my dad, who was lying next to me, sound asleep, his heavy snores making it impossible for me to wake him up. My sister, too, was completely unaware, lost in her own world of dreams. I felt so small in that moment, so alone. I grabbed the pillow and threw it at my dad's face, hoping to jar him awake. As soon as the pillow hit him, the light disappeared. Just like that, the buzzing stopped, the light blinked out of existence, and the air around me felt thick with silence. My dad stirred, his hands swatting the pillow away, but by the time he opened his eyes, everything was back to normal. The skylight was clear. There was no light, no buzzing, no strange sensation. The room was just as it had been before, with only the sound of my sister snoring and the wind outside. I don't know what happened that night. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to catch my breath, wondering if I'd imagined it all. But the buzzing had been real, and the colors had been real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had just happened, something that didn't fit into any explanation I could come up with. It was like I had witnessed something that shouldn't have existed in the quiet, peaceful woods. I never told anyone about it that night. I didn't want to sound crazy. My dad probably would have just laughed it off, and my sister would have thought I was being dramatic. So I kept it to myself, hoping that it was just some strange trick of the mind, a bizarre, one-time experience that would never repeat itself. But over the next few days, the unease lingered. I kept looking up at the skylight, half expecting the light to return. I couldn't shake the memory of the buzzing or the unnatural flash of colors. I thought about it constantly, even as we spent the rest of the week hiking and fishing and doing all the usual things we did when we went to the cabin. Every time the wind howled outside, I found myself jumping at the sound. Every time a strange noise echoed through the trees, I wondered if it was that same buzzing sound, just waiting to come back. By the time we packed up to leave, I had convinced myself it was just a weird experience. I had to admit to myself that it was probably nothing. The mind can play tricks, especially in the dark when you're isolated. But that night, the night of the strange light and the buzzing noise, still stayed with me. Even now, as an adult, I can't explain it. We've sold the cabin since then, and I haven't been back to that part of Michigan in years. But every once in a while, when I'm lying in bed, the memory creeps back into my mind. I wonder if it was just a freak occurrence, some odd fluke of nature, or maybe it was something else, something out there in the dark woods that I'll never understand. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, and I've learned that not every mystery needs to be solved. Some things are just meant to stay unanswered. I grew up in Brooklyn, and for most of my childhood, I had never seen the woods. Not in real life, at least. I knew them from TV and movies, from the pages of books, from stories people told. But I had never actually been surrounded by trees, never walked through anything resembling a forest, never felt that kind of isolation. Brooklyn was loud, crowded, and packed with concrete. I could always hear car horns, music blasting from passing cars, the distant hum of conversations, footsteps on the pavement, the rattle of a train somewhere overhead or below. Even late at night, when the streets got quiet, the city still made noise. It was comforting in a way. It meant life was still happening around me. So when I was a young teenager and someone took me to Prospect Park, walking me through the wooded trails, it felt like stepping onto another planet. I knew the park was there, of course. I had seen it on maps, heard people mention it. I had been near it before, walked past the entrance, maybe even played on the grass once or twice as a kid. But I had never gone deep inside. I had never wandered into the trails where the trees got thick, where the noise of the city faded, where the light changed, where the air smelled different. At first, I just felt uncomfortable. The dirt paths, the fallen leaves, the branches overhead, the way the trees blocked out the sky. It wasn't natural to me. It wasn't right. Felt wrong. Like I had stepped into a place I didn't belong. Like the city had an edge and I had just crossed it. And then, as we walked deeper, the feeling got worse. The trees grew denser, and the shadows stretched long over the path. The sounds of the city, horns, voices, music, faded into the background. Now all I could hear was the crunch of my own footsteps, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, the rustle of leaves when the wind moved through them. And something about that silence felt unnatural, too deep, too empty, like the trees were swallowing up sound. It was scary enough just being in that unfamiliar space. But then I saw the face. It was just off the trail, hidden in the brush, peeking out from the bushes. Pale, vacant face. A white girl's face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Her mouth was open, frozen mid-scream. Her expression was empty, no life, no recognition, no reaction. My heart slammed into my ribs. I stopped breathing. My whole body locked up. It was the kind of fear that hit instantly, violently. No processing, no second-guessing. Just raw animal terror. My mind jumped straight to the worst possible conclusion. I wasn't even thinking in words, just images, flashes of horror stories, crime shows, news reports, urban legends. Everyone knew that serial killers dumped bodies in places like this. The woods were where people disappeared. The woods were where bad things happened. I stared at the face, and the face stared back. My legs felt like cement. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My stomach felt hollow, my hands shook. My mind tried to piece it together, tried to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, after what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, I saw it. The face wasn't real. It wasn't a person at all. It was plastic. Some weirdo had dumped an inflatable sex doll in the bushes. The realization hit like a slap. The fear in my chest twisted into something else. Something ridiculous, something embarrassing. My breath came back in a rush, and I almost laughed out loud, but the sound came out shaky. I felt stupid. Stupid for being so scared. Stupid for jumping to conclusions. But the fear hadn't been fake. It had been real. My body had believed it. I forced myself to move closer just to be sure. My feet felt heavy as I stepped off the trail, pushing through the brush. The branches scratched my arms, and the leaves crunched under my sneakers. My heart was still pounding, but I had to see it up close. I had to prove to myself that it wasn't real. And there it was, a crumpled, filthy, inflatable doll. Its face frozen in that eerie, open-mouthed expression. Its body twisted in an unnatural position, half buried in the dirt and leaves. One of its arms was torn, the plastic sagging. It had probably been there for weeks, maybe longer. I exhaled, my breath shaky. It wasn't a body. It wasn't real. But that feeling, that moment when I had first seen it, that had been real. The raw, immediate terror. The certainty that I had just stumbled across something unspeakable. The realization that I was deep in the woods, away from the safety of the city, surrounded by nothing but trees and shadows. That fear had been real. I turned back to the trail, my legs still weak. I wanted to leave, get out of the woods, back to the open air, back to the sound of traffic, back to something familiar. As I walked, the fear faded, but something else stayed. A feeling I couldn't quite shake. Not fear exactly, more like awareness. A realization that the world had edges I hadn't seen before. That the city, for all its noise and danger, had always been familiar. And that the woods, quiet, dark, empty, were something else entirely. Something I didn't understand, and maybe never would. The Appalachian Trail is long enough that you can go days without seeing another person, depending on the section you're in. That was part of the appeal for my girlfriend and me. We weren't through hiking, just taking time off to see how much we could cover in a 3-month stretch. The At had always been one of those things I wanted to experience properly. Not just short weekend trips, but a real stretch of it, moving from state to state, living off what we carried, filtering water from streams, falling asleep to the sound of nothing but the wind in the trees. It was late summer, maybe early fall, though the days still felt long and warm. We had been hiking for hours that day, and as far as I could tell, we were the only people around. No other hikers, no trail runners, no sign of anyone else using this stretch in at least a day or two. The trail was well-trodden but quiet. It was just us and the forest. I was ahead of my girlfriend, maybe 50 yards or so, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a weird shadow on the trail. Then, as I got closer, I saw it clearly. A brass eagle, big, heavy-looking, just sitting there on a stump, like someone had placed it carefully. It made no sense. This was the middle of nowhere. There were no houses nearby, no easy roads leading here, no reason for something like this to be out here. It wasn't rusted or broken. It looked old but not weathered, like someone had carried it out here recently. I stood there for a while, staring at it, then glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching me. But there was no one, just the trees, tall and silent. I don't know why, but I didn't touch it. Something about it felt off, like it wasn't meant to be disturbed. My girlfriend caught up a minute later. I didn't say anything about it right away, just pointed. She frowned, looking at it the same way I had. "That's weird," she muttered, and we kept walking. But it didn't stop there. As we hiked, we started seeing more things. Random objects, each one left behind alone. Not trash, not the usual lost gear you'd find on a long trail, just things. A single shoe, an old metal lunchbox, a child's sock, a rusted hand crank egg beater. None of it made sense. I tried to ignore it, but as the sun started sinking, the feeling of unease grew. It was like someone was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, but for what, I had no idea. By the time we reached the shelter for the night, I was on edge. The shelter was an old wooden lean-to, like most of them on the At. 3 walls, an open front, a raised sleeping platform inside. There was a fire pit out front, a log for sitting, and a few old carvings in the beams from hikers passing through over the years. And then there was him, an old man sitting by the fire. His clothes were dirty, worn down to almost rags. His hair was long and tangled, beard thick and unkempt. But the first thing I noticed wasn't his face or his clothes. It was his staff. He had a wooden walking stick, smoothed down from years of use. And mounted on the top was a baby doll's head. Faded, plastic, sun-bleached. The eyes were missing, just 2 empty sockets staring out. I felt my stomach drop. He looked up when we approached but didn't say anything. Just nodded slightly. I didn't want to stay. My gut was screaming at me to keep walking, find another place to camp, even if it meant pushing a few extra miles in the dark. But the next shelter was too far and we were exhausted. So we stayed. We set up on the top level of the shelter, keeping our distance from him. I laid out my sleeping bag, but I knew I wouldn't be sleeping much that night. As the fire crackled below, he started talking. Not to us, not directly, but just talking, like he was telling stories to the night itself. He said he used to drive a cab in New Orleans. That was how it started. At first, it was just normal rambling. Stories about drunk tourists, long nights, strange passengers. But then it got darker. He started talking about the things he'd seen in the rearview mirror. How he didn't mind if people had sex in his cab because he could watch. He laughed when he said it. Not like a joke, but like he was remembering it fondly. I laid there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. My girlfriend was curled up next to me, silent, but I could tell she wasn't sleeping either. He kept talking for hours, his voice low, mumbling, sometimes trailing off before picking up again. At some point, the fire died down, and then there was silence. I don't know if I dozed off or if I was just in that strange half-asleep state where your body is still alert, listening. But at some point in the night, I heard movement. Soft, slow. Not the sound of someone turning in their sleep. The sound of footsteps. I held my breath. The shelter creaked. He was moving. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just listened. The footsteps stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, staring into the darkness, waiting. But eventually, the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees. As soon as there was enough light to see, we packed up. Quietly, quickly. Before we left, I pulled out a couple of power bars and set them down near where he was still lying. He hadn't moved, or at least he looked like he hadn't. His breathing was deep, slow, asleep, or pretending to be. We didn't say a word until we were miles down the trail. Neither of us looked back. That was the last time we saw another person for 3 days. I don't know why I picked that spot. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the trees swayed so lazily in the breeze. The way the hills rolled out in every direction, making the world feel endless. Maybe it was just because I wanted to be alone. Either way, I regret it now. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. Nothing too crazy, just a few days out in the woods, away from everything. I packed light but smart. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, a portable stove, my knife, and a .22 rifle for small game. I wasn't expecting to hunt much, but I liked having it just in case. The location was remote, about an hour off the main road, then another 2 miles down an overgrown trail that probably hadn't seen a vehicle in years. I parked my truck in a small clearing just off the path and hiked the rest of the way in, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. By the time I found a good spot to set up camp, the sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. I was deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. There was a small stream nearby, enough to filter water if needed, and plenty of dry wood for a fire. It was perfect. I spent the first evening settling in, pitching my tent, gathering firewood, cooking a simple meal of beans and jerky. The night was cool but not cold, and the fire crackled softly as I sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush. It was peaceful. I should have left the next morning. I woke up just before dawn, the air crisp and damp with morning dew. I unzipped the tent and stretched, taking a deep breath of fresh, pine-scented air. Everything was still, the kind of stillness that only exists in the early morning hours before the world wakes up. But something was wrong. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My camp looked the same, fire pit undisturbed, gear untouched. But the silence, it wasn't normal. The crickets had stopped. The birds weren't chirping. Even the wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily quiet. I felt it then, that deep gut-level unease, like something was watching me. I scanned the tree line, my heart beating a little too fast for my liking. Nothing, just trees thick and endless. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sometimes the forest just got quiet. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a fox, a bobcat, maybe even a bear. Nothing I couldn't handle. Shaking off the nerves, I went about my morning routine, boiled some water, made instant coffee, ate a granola bar. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting to see something standing there. I never did. That night, I made sure to keep the fire going longer than usual. It made me feel safer, even if I couldn't explain why. I crawled into my tent around midnight, the rifle within arm's reach, just in case. The woods were still too quiet, but I was exhausted. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime later, I woke up. First, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not a deer. Not a raccoon. Not a bear. These were human footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just outside my camp. I held my breath. Every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps circled my tent, moving steadily, unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't in a rush. I reached for my rifle, careful not to make a sound. My mind raced. Was it a lost hiker? A hunter? Someone who had stumbled upon my camp by accident? Or was it someone who knew I was here? The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, slowly, they started again, moving away this time, back into the trees. The crunch of leaves and twigs faded into the distance until there was nothing but silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal after all. Maybe I had been half dreaming. But when I stepped out of my tent, my blood went cold. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled my tent once, then disappeared into the trees. I packed up my camp in record time. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I started the hike back toward my truck, moving fast but trying not to seem panicked. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. Then, about halfway back, I saw it. A tree, carved into the bark, deep and deliberate, were the words, "Don't come back." I ran. I don't even remember making the decision to do it. I just took off, sprinting down the trail, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing against my back. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't look behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I nearly collapsed against the door, fumbling with the keys. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, tires kicking up dust, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror, and I saw him, a man, standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't even think. I just kept driving, faster and faster, until I hit the main road and didn't look back. I never reported it. What would I have even said? A man walked around my tent at night, and I got scared. The cops wouldn't have done anything. I still don't know who he was. A hermit? A squatter? Someone who just didn't want people in his woods? Or something worse? I never went back to that spot. I still camp, but never alone. And I always, always listen to my gut. Because out there, deep in the woods, far from help, sometimes the scariest thing isn't a wild animal or the weather. Sometimes it's another person. The swamp was quiet, too quiet. I noticed it first when I woke up. Normally, mornings in the Okefenokee came alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and frogs. A never-ending chorus of life that blended together into something both beautiful and constant. But that morning, there was nothing. Not a single chirp, no buzzing of insects, no splashing from unseen creatures moving through the water. Just silence. I sat up in the tent and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. My girlfriend was still curled up in her sleeping bag, her face barely visible under the folds of fabric. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping out into the humid air. The swamp stretched out before me, still covered in a thick, heavy mist that hovered just above the dark water. The trees stood motionless, their roots twisting and reaching into the water like skeletal fingers. I didn't like it. I was used to silence in the woods at times, but this was different. This wasn't just an absence of sound. It felt like something had pressed pause on the entire swamp. Even the water seemed unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. I turned back toward the tent and nudged my girlfriend awake. She stirred, blinking up at me before groaning softly. "Come on," I said. "Let's take the canoe out." We had talked about doing some early morning paddling the night before, and despite the eerie quiet, I figured we should stick to the plan. Maybe it was just a weird shift in the weather or something. Within a few minutes, we had packed up some snacks and water, grabbed the paddles, and pushed the canoe into the water. The surface barely rippled as we climbed in. Normally, the water was alive with movement. Fish darting below, insects skating across the surface. But today, it was like we were the only things moving. The mist sat thick above the water, curling around the trees and clinging to the air like it didn't want to let go. We started paddling. The sound of our paddles cutting through the water echoed strangely. Every stroke felt heavier than usual, like the swamp was pushing back against us. We moved slowly at first, adjusting to the eerie atmosphere. The further we went, the thicker the fog seemed to get. It wasn't normal morning mist. It felt like a barrier, a solid wall of white swallowing everything ahead of us. We didn't see a single other person. No campers, no hikers, no other canoes or kayaks gliding through the water. Just us. Then we rounded a bend. The sound that followed was something I had never heard before. It wasn't a growl, not exactly. It wasn't just a deep bellow either. It was huge. A low, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated through my chest, rattled my ribs, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was so loud that I felt it more than I heard it. A primal noise that seemed to reach deep into something ancient in my brain and tell it, "You do not belong here." We stopped paddling immediately. The canoe rocked slightly as we sat frozen, listening. The swamp swallowed the sound just as quickly as it had come. Nothing moved. The mist still clung to the air, making it impossible to see far in any direction. I glanced at my girlfriend. Her eyes were wide, her hands gripping the paddle so tightly her knuckles were white. We both knew what it was, an alligator, but it wasn't like anything we had ever heard before. I had seen plenty of gators on previous trips, even heard them rumble from a distance, but this was different. Louder, bigger. Then the water behind us stirred. I turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. Rising from the surface, almost in perfect unison, were sets of eyes. 1, 2, 5, 10. More. The backs of at least 20 alligators broke the surface behind us, their dark, armored bodies barely making a ripple in the water. They had appeared so silently, so suddenly, that it was like they had been waiting just beneath the surface, watching. I gritted my teeth and started to paddle. Slowly. The alligators didn't move at first. They just floated there, watching. Then, as if responding to some unseen signal, the low rumbles started again. This time, they came from every direction. Behind us, to our left, to our right, from the tree-covered banks ahead. I had never felt so small in my life. We paddled forward. The gators followed. Every time I glanced behind us, more had surfaced. Their eyes reflected in the dim morning light, unblinking, unmoving, just watching. Then, ahead, the water rippled. I looked forward just in time to see the first massive tail slide from the bank into the water, followed by another. More ripples spread across the surface, more scales rising from below. I realized with a sick feeling that we weren't just being followed. We were being herded. The water ahead of us wasn't clear. The path was closing. Then, just as I brought my paddle down, something surfaced directly beneath it. I barely had time to react before the blade of the paddle struck something solid. A massive alligator, easily the biggest I had ever seen, rose from the depths directly beneath us. My paddle smacked the top of its skull, and the response was instant. The water exploded. The gator thrashed, its enormous head smashing into the side of the canoe. The entire boat lurched violently. Water poured in as the side dipped low. For a split second, I thought we were going in. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the beast vanished beneath the canoe. The water churned and bubbled where it had been, then stilled. I didn't hesitate. We paddled forward, straight into the open water ahead of us, the only path that wasn't completely blocked. Gators still surrounded us, but they didn't move. They just floated, watching. The huge one bellowed one last time. I stole a final glance behind us. The big gator, the one that had nearly tipped us, was still there, floating just where we had left it. Its eyes locked onto us, completely still except for the slow rise and fall of its back above the water. Then, as if satisfied, it sank. One by one, the other gators followed. We kept paddling, not stopping, not slowing down, until we finally reached a small patch of land further up the waterway. The moment the canoe scraped against the shore, we jumped out. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled onto solid ground. We sat there for a long time, staring out at the water. Nothing moved. The mist still hovered. The swamp still felt eerily silent. But the alligators were gone. Eventually, the sounds of the swamp started to return. Distant bird calls, the faint buzzing of insects, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to. Not supernatural, not paranormal, just something real, something old, something that had been there long before us and would still be there long after. I don't know why I agreed to go hiking alone that weekend. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was just plain stupidity. I'd been hiking for years, always with friends or in small groups, but after my last trip got canceled and everyone bailed, I convinced myself I could handle it alone. It was just a 2-day trek, one night out in the woods, then back to the car. I had done longer hikes, harder hikes, but never alone. Still, I figured I'd be fine. I parked at the trailhead just after noon, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The trail was one of those lesser-known routes that branched off a more popular path, leading deeper into the mountains. I liked that it wasn't crowded, just the sound of my boots on dirt, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig as some unseen animal moved through the trees. It was peaceful at first. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound steadily uphill, narrow in places but well-worn, cutting through thick pine forests before opening up to a ridgeline with a view of the valley below. I stopped there to drink some water and take in the view. The sky was clear, and I could see for miles. A good start. By late afternoon, I made it to a clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was a flat spot near a small stream, tucked between trees, with just enough open sky to let in some light. I set down my pack, stretched out my legs, and started gathering wood for a fire. That was when I noticed it, the silence. It had been quiet before, but this was different. No birds, no wind, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my own nerves. But as I bent down to pick up a branch, I felt something else. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like you're being watched. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the same thick forest, the same unmoving branches. I told myself I was overthinking things. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bobcat or a bear, something that made the smaller animals go quiet. That had to be it. I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on setting up camp. The firewood, the tent, the sleeping bag. I went through the motions, trying to shake the unease. By the time the sun started setting, the normal sounds of the forest had returned, and I felt stupid for letting my imagination get to me. I cooked a quick meal over the fire, ate in silence, and crawled into my sleeping bag just as the temperature started to drop. I left the fire burning low, just enough for some light, then shut my eyes and listened to the wind rustling the trees. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate movement. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, not an animal. Too slow, too careful. They circled the tent once, then stopped. Just standing there. I could feel it. Whoever it was, they were watching. I didn't move. I stayed as still as possible, heart hammering, trying to listen over the sound of my own pulse. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I lay there for what felt like hours before finally convincing myself to move. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to see outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow, but nothing else looked disturbed. No tracks, no sign of anyone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, gripping my knife, listening. The woods never went silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching from the dark. When the first light of dawn hit, I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking back. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out. I moved quickly, almost too quickly, slipping on loose dirt as I made my way back toward the main trail. I had only gone about a mile when I saw it, something that stopped me dead in my tracks. My own footprints from the day before, but next to them another set. Not animal tracks, not boots, bare feet. Someone had been following me. I stared at them, my stomach twisting into knots. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever had circled my tent had been tracking me long before I even set up camp. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on me. I didn't stop for water, didn't look around. I just pushed forward, listening for any sound behind me. Then, about half a mile from the main trail, I saw something ahead, something hanging from a tree. A deer skull, not old, not bleached from time. Fresh, hung with twine, swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt sick. I forced myself to move, walking faster, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop again until I hit the main trail. I practically ran the last mile back to my car. When I finally reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly, I fumbled the keys trying to unlock the door. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't file a report. What would I even say? That some barefoot stranger had followed me into the woods, circled my tent, and left a fresh deer skull hanging in my path? I didn't go hiking alone again after that. And no matter how much time passes, I still wonder. If I had left my tent just a little too soon that night, would I have seen them? And would I have made it back? The road was barely more than a pair of tire tracks carved through the Alabama woods, a winding, uneven stretch of packed dirt that hadn't seen pavement in 100 years. It was the kind of place where you didn't expect to see another soul, especially not at this time of night. The headlights of my Volvo station wagon cut through the dark, bouncing with every dip and rut in the road. The trees crowded in on either side, thick and heavy with Spanish moss, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. There wasn't a single streetlight for miles, just the pale glow of the moon filtering through the canopy and the occasional reflection of my headlights bouncing off the white headstones of the old cemetery we had just passed. It was an old burial ground, the kind of place that looked forgotten. The stones were weathered and lopsided, some leaning so far they were half buried in the ground. No fresh flowers, no signs that anyone had visited in years. Just a few crumbling family plots and a rusted iron fence that barely stood anymore. Even in the daytime, it had an eerie feel to it. Night, it was worse. I had been driving these back roads with my friend, who knew the area better than I did. We weren't out here for any real reason, just cruising, killing time, talking about nothing. It was the kind of thing you did when you were young and there wasn't much else to do. Then the truck appeared. At first, it was just headlights in the rearview mirror, distant but gaining. The road was empty for miles in every direction, and the last house we had passed had been way back near the highway. Even out here, seeing a vehicle wasn't impossible, but it was damn rare. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe some old farmer heading home, or some other kids out exploring the same way we were. But then the truck got closer. Too close. Its grille filled my rearview mirror, the bright white beams of its high beams flooding my car. The truck was old, boxy, American-made, probably from the 70s or 80s, with one of those massive steel front bumpers. I tapped my brakes lightly, a signal that they were too close. They didn't back off. If anything, they inched closer. I could feel the first trickle of unease creep into my stomach. There was no reason for them to be riding my ass like this, not on a road like this. There was plenty of space.
No rush.
No need to be anywhere this late at night. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just impatient. Maybe they didn't realize how close they were. I sped up. The truck did too. Now I was pushing my Volvo harder than I should have, my tires skidding slightly on the loose dirt as I rounded a curve. The truck stayed right with me, its massive front end barely a car's length away. I glanced at my friend, and even in the dim glow of the dashboard, I could see that he was tense. This wasn't normal. I hit another straightaway and pushed the gas pedal harder. The trees blurred past, my headlights bouncing wildly with the uneven road. The truck didn't fall back. I didn't know who was driving it, but they weren't just trying to pass. They were following me, pushing me. For what? My heart started hammering in my chest. I had no idea how long this went on, but it felt like forever. Just the roar of my engine, the rattle of loose gravel under my tires, and the deafening silence between us. I could feel the road shifting beneath me, the ruts getting deeper, the turns getting sharper. I wasn't sure how much faster I could go before I lost control. Then my friend spoke up, his voice tight. We're coming up on a paved road, a T-intersection. I didn't take my eyes off the road. There's another dirt road right off it, he added. If you can get a little ahead, we can whip in there and ditch them. I didn't respond. I just focused. The next few turns were brutal. My tires slid in the dirt. My back end fishtailed more than once, but I managed to keep control. Then I saw it, the paved road ahead. I pushed the pedal harder, trying to gain just a little more distance. The truck was still there, but just far enough back that I might be able to pull it off. The second I hit the pavement, I yanked the wheel left. My tires screamed as I slid, the whole car shuddering. And that's when I saw it. Just past the edge of the road, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the tree line, something was standing there. Tall, too tall, covered in thick, matted hair from head to toe. I barely had time to register it before I was already turning, but my mouth opened anyway. Holy shit, do you see? Before I could finish, my friend cut me off. That big, tall, hairy guy. I jerked the wheel hard and tore into the side road, my heart pounding. The truck behind us shot past, flying down the paved road, missing our turn completely. We sat there for a few seconds, watching its taillights disappear into the night. Silence, just the sound of the engine idling, our breath coming hard and fast. I didn't move, neither did he. Then, slowly, I turned to look back toward the tree line. Nothing. Whatever we had seen was gone. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, I forced my hands off the wheel. My knuckles were white from gripping it so hard. We didn't say anything. After a while, I put the car back in gear and started driving, slow at first, then faster. I wanted to be as far from that spot as possible. Neither of us spoke the rest of the drive back. We didn't need to. To this day, I don't know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. I know what bears look like. They're bulky, they have a certain shape to them. This was different. Tall, lanky, almost human, but wrong. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe our brains filled in the gaps. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something standing there, watching us, and we had gotten just close enough to see it. I don't know what we were expecting. That's the thought that stuck with me later. Maybe we just wanted a weekend away from everything. Away from work, away from people, just the two of us in the middle of nowhere, drinking beers by a fire, sleeping under the stars. Maybe we just wanted some space to breathe. The national forest we picked was deep. Not the kind of place you'd find on a list of top camping spots or hiking trails. There weren't any scenic overlooks or marked paths. Just miles of thick trees and mountains that swallowed the sky. That's what we were looking for. The remoteness was the appeal. A place so far out that no one would bother us. A place so quiet the only sounds at night would be the crackling fire and the wind moving through the trees. It wasn't until later that I remembered the story about the family that had gone missing out there. The mother and kid made it out, but the father never did. Search teams gave up after a while. The land was just too rough, too endless. Anything could have happened to him. At the time, though, it was just a distant piece of news, not something that felt real to me. We spent the afternoon winding through old logging roads, taking turn after turn, following nothing but instinct. Eventually, we found a spot near a lake, about 100 or 200 yards from where we parked. Felt perfect, quiet, isolated. The kind of place where you could sit by the water and feel like you were the only two people left in the world. We set up camp around 4. The air was still warm from the late summer sun, but you could already feel the evening chill creeping in. We got a fire going and started cracking beers as the sun dipped below the trees. There wasn't much else to do but drink, talk, and let the fire keep us company. That's when we noticed the trucks. First, it was just one. Headlights moving through the woods, slow and deliberate. The driver wasn't in a hurry. The truck slowed as it passed, just enough for whoever was inside to see our fire. Then it kept going, disappearing into the trees. Then another, and another. Each one slowed just like the first, watching. It wasn't normal. People don't just go joyriding through the deep woods at night unless they have a reason to be out there. And these guys had a reason. I should have trusted my gut. That feeling, the one that sends a little electric pulse through your body when something isn't right. It was there, buzzing just beneath the surface. But the beers dulled it, made me feel braver than I was, made us both feel like checking it out was a good idea. So we went. We followed the direction the trucks had gone, deeper into the woods. There was a party, or at least that's what it looked like. A big bonfire in a clearing. A group of about 15 or 20 guys gathered around, drinking, talking, laughing. The first thing I noticed was the camper. It sat just behind the fire, old and covered in moss, like it hadn't moved in years. The second thing I noticed was the guns. One guy had a pistol on his hip. Another was leaning against a truck, shotgun resting casually in his arms. No one was hunting. This wasn't some weekend trip into the woods with rifles for deer. This was different. We should have turned back right then. But someone saw us before we could make up our minds. A guy from the group broke away and walked toward us, beer in hand, smiling. He acted friendly, told us to come have a drink. I hesitated, but my buddy was already stepping forward. And once you're in, you're in. The guys around the fire were loose, talking loudly, laughing, throwing back drinks. A few were talking about coke, meth. Normal people don't bring that shit out to the woods just to party. But the older guys, the ones who looked like they had real weight in the group, weren't laughing. They weren't saying much at all. They just watched. Then something shifted. A group of 4 or 5 guys had been standing near the camper, not really joining in. They stepped inside for a few minutes, and when they came back out, the mood changed. The friendly act was gone. One of them sneered and said he saw us making out. I didn't even have time to react before one of them took a swing at my buddy, connected, and he stumbled back. My gut went cold. I turned and started walking away. Fast. Then I heard my buddy scrambling behind me. He must have taken a few more hits before he managed to break free, because when he caught up, I could hear the way his breathing had changed, sharp and panicked. We ran blind through the woods, only knowing the direction we needed to go, toward the embers of our fire. But they were coming after us. I could hear them, branches snapping, boots slamming against the ground, and some of them had guns. We burst into our campsite, barely slowing down. The tent had all our shit in it, but there wasn't time to pack. We ripped the stakes out, trying to grab the whole thing and toss it in the car. Then the scream, 50 yards away. Asterisk, asterisk, kill the faggots. Asterisk, asterisk. I don't think we even looked at each other. There was no need. We just ran. Dropped everything and ran for the car. The second we got in, my buddy floored it. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and we shot forward, barely making it back onto the logging road. I thought we were good. Then headlights flared up behind us. I turned my head, and my stomach clenched. It was the truck. The one the guy with the shotgun had been leaning on, and it was coming fast. We were tearing through the forest, the road nothing but a mess of gravel and dirt, potholes big enough to flip us if we hit one wrong. The truck was right there, only a couple feet behind, close enough that I could see the shadowy shape of the driver through the windshield. I looked at the speedometer. 45, 50. The next turn was coming up fast. A sharp hairpin, the kind that could send you off the mountain if you took it too fast. But there was no choice. My buddy didn't slow down. He yanked the wheel hard, and for a second, I felt the car slipping, tires losing grip. I thought we were going over. I braced for it, for the feeling of weightlessness before the crash. Somehow, the tires caught. The car jerked back onto the road, and when I looked in the mirror, the truck was farther back. The turn had slowed them down. We kept going. Didn't stop until the road turned to pavement, smooth and safe beneath us. That's when the headlights behind us veered off, disappearing into the woods. We didn't talk, didn't say a word the whole drive back. It wasn't until the next day, when the adrenaline had worn off and the weight of it all sank in, that we put it together. The camper, the guns, the guys keeping watch. It was a meth lab. Nothing else made sense. A deep woods operation, hidden where no one would find it. We'd walked straight into something we weren't supposed to see. We never went back, never even talked about camping again. That was the night we learned what remote really meant. I had been out in the Utah wilderness for nearly 3 weeks with Outward Bound. 3 weeks of hiking, climbing, and learning how to survive off what we carried on our backs. It was exhausting, but rewarding in a way that was hard to put into words. I had learned how to read the land, how to find water, how to make a fire, how to keep myself safe. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for those 2 days of complete isolation. At the end of the program, we were sent out on a solo. Just 1 to 2 days alone in the wilderness, close enough that if something went wrong, help could come, but far enough away that you were well and truly by yourself. The rules were simple. Stay put, don't wander off, and if you get in trouble, blow the whistle they gave you. Other than that, we were completely alone. When the instructor dropped me off at my designated spot, he gave me a quick nod and walked off. No long speeches, no pep talks, just a simple acknowledgement that I was on my own now. The sun was still up, maybe mid-afternoon, and the first thing I did was set up my little camp. They didn't give us much, just a tarp, a small amount of food, a sleeping bag, and the whistle. No tent, no fire, just enough to keep us from freezing or starving. I picked a relatively flat area between a couple of trees, set up my tarp so it could provide a bit of shelter, and laid my sleeping bag out underneath. The wind was mild, rustling through the dry brush around me. It wasn't too hot, but the sun was relentless, baking the ground beneath me. I could hear the occasional chirp of birds, the distant sound of the wind brushing over the hills. It was peaceful in a way, though there was a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. After making sure everything was in place, I decided to take a short walk around my immediate area. We weren't supposed to go far, just enough to get a feel for our surroundings. I stepped carefully, watching the ground for loose rocks or hidden holes. The terrain was rough, a mix of dry dirt, scattered shrubs, and the occasional gnarled tree. The air smelled clean, crisp, untouched by civilization. That was when I saw it. At first, I didn't realize what I was looking at. It was just a dark shape among the brush, something that didn't quite belong. I walked closer, slow and careful. The second I saw the exposed ribs, I froze. It was the remains of an elk. The thing had been dead for a while. The fur was mostly gone, leaving behind dark, leathery skin stretched over bone. The rib cage had been cracked open, some of the ribs completely broken off. The legs were missing, the skull a good 3 feet away from where the rest of the body lay. The spine was still mostly intact, but something had been gnawing at it, leaving deep grooves in the bone. I crouched down, inspecting it closer. There was no way this was a natural death. Something had killed this elk, and whatever had done it had torn it apart, eaten most of the meat, and left the rest to rot. My stomach twisted. There weren't many animals out here that could do this. A black bear, maybe, but black bears were skittish. They didn't usually go for something as big as an elk unless they were desperate. A brown bear, on the other hand, that would be bad. If a brown bear was still in the area, I'd be in serious trouble. Coyotes could have scavenged it, sure, but they wouldn't have taken down something this big. Wolves? Possible, but unlikely. There weren't many wolves left in Utah, and even if there were, they didn't usually leave such a messy kill. Then there was the worst option, a mountain lion. A mountain lion could take down an elk, and if it had made this kill, there was a good chance it was still close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My eyes darted around the trees, scanning for any movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. But the forest was still, too still. I swallowed hard and took a step back. My brain was screaming at me to run, to put as much distance between me and that carcass as possible. But running was the worst thing I could do. If a mountain lion was nearby, running would only trigger its instincts. So I forced myself to walk, slow, steady, keeping my head on a swivel, scanning every shadow, every rustling bush. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I finally made it back to my tarp, I let out a shaky breath. I wasn't sure what to do. The instructors had been clear we weren't supposed to leave our spot, no matter what. If we had a problem, we were supposed to blow the whistle. But what was I supposed to do? Tell them I found a dead elk? That I was scared? That wasn't an emergency. I sat down on my sleeping bag, staring at the trees. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its place. I didn't feel safe. The thought of lying down, closing my eyes, knowing that something had killed an elk not 50 feet from where I was sleeping, it made my skin crawl. My logical brain told me that whatever had done it was probably long gone, that it had already eaten, that it wouldn't bother with me. But another part of me, the primal, instinctual part, was screaming at me that I was in danger. Night fell. I didn't sleep. Every little sound had me on edge. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, gripping the safety whistle so tight my fingers ached. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to something moving outside my tarp. I froze. It was close. I could hear its slow, deliberate movements, the crunch of dirt beneath heavy paws. Not the quick, skittering steps of a coyote. Something bigger. My breath caught in my throat. Then silence. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. Had I imagined it? Then, just as I was about to relax, snap. A twig, breaking not 20 feet from where I lay. I gripped the whistle tighter, my mind racing. Should I blow it? Should I wait? Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound was gone. I lay there, heart hammering, waiting for what felt like an eternity. But nothing else happened. No more movement, no more sounds. Eventually, the sky started to lighten. The sun crept up over the horizon, bathing the landscape in dull orange light. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching from how tense I had been all night. I scanned the area around my tarp. Nothing. No tracks. No signs of anything being there. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't alone out there. When the instructors came to collect me later that day, I didn't say anything. What would I even say? That I had been scared? That I thought something was watching me? They would have just shrugged, told me it was part of the experience. But as I hiked back to meet up with the rest of the group, I glanced back one last time at the place where I had spent the night. Something had been out there with me, and whatever it was, it had been close. The first time I saw the man, I thought he was a tree. It was early afternoon, and I was hiking alone through the deep woods of northern Idaho, following a poorly maintained trail that was little more than a series of faded blazes on tree trunks. I had been walking for hours, far from the nearest road or campsite, deep in an area where few people ever went. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The forest was dense, the kind of place where you could lose the sun before evening even arrived. The trees stood thick and silent, their branches shifting slightly in the occasional breeze, but there was no real wind, no birdsong, no distant sound of water, just the crunch of my boots against the leaf-covered ground and my own steady breathing. I was moving carefully, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead, when something made me stop. A feeling, the same kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. At first, I saw nothing but trunks and shadows. Then, about 50 feet away, I saw him. He was standing perfectly still. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that he was just another tree in the endless rows of trees. But there was something off about his shape. Too straight, too stiff, the outline of a body, standing between two pines, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the canopy. He wasn't moving. For a long moment, neither did I. I just stood there, staring, trying to convince myself that I was seeing nothing at all. Then I blinked, and he was gone. Not like he ran or ducked out of sight, just gone. One moment there, the next, nothing but trees. A chill ran down my back, but I told myself I was being stupid. Shadows could play tricks. The brain could misinterpret shapes. I had been alone for too long, my mind turning the trees into things that weren't really there. Still, I picked up my pace. I had planned to make camp in a few hours, but now I wanted to find a spot sooner, preferably somewhere near a stream or an open area, not trapped in the deep woods where my vision was limited. The feeling of being watched never really left. I set up camp in a small clearing, a little patch of earth surrounded by thick trees. It wasn't ideal, too many places where something could be lurking just beyond sight, but I was exhausted and wanted to be done walking before dark. I gathered wood, built a fire, and ate a quick meal. The whole time, I kept glancing up at the trees, half expecting to see him again. But I didn't. By the time night fell, the fire was crackling, and I tried to relax. The woods had a different feel at night. The silence wasn't comforting, but it was normal. The forest at night was supposed to be quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I stayed up longer than I normally would have, staring into the fire, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I climbed into my sleeping bag, telling myself I had imagined the whole thing. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. There was no sound, no movement, just a feeling that something was wrong. I lay there, completely still, listening. Then I heard it, breathing, not close, not right outside my tent, but somewhere nearby, deep and slow. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference. A deer, a bear, even a cougar, they moved. They made noise. They didn't just stand there, breathing. I lay frozen, staring at the tent wall, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. The breathing didn't stop. Then slowly it faded. Not like someone walking away. More like it just blended into the background, swallowed by the silence. I didn't move for the rest of the night. Morning came. I didn't waste time packing up. I was moving before the sun had fully risen, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that campsite. The plan had been to spend another 2 nights in the woods, but now I wanted out. I had enough supplies to make it back in a day if I pushed myself. So I pushed. The forest felt different that morning. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the trees were leaning closer, the trail less familiar. I had followed the same path in, but now something was off. The blazes on the trees looked older, faded. The terrain felt unfamiliar. I told myself I was just on edge, that I hadn't actually gotten lost. Then I found the first footprint. It was fresh, a boot print just off the trail. Not mine. I stopped, looked around. No one. I had been walking fast, not paying attention to what was behind me. Had someone been following me this whole time? I kept moving, faster now. Hours passed. I should have reached the edge of the forest by midday, but the trees stretched on and on. The sun was already sinking lower, and I knew something was wrong. I was lost. By late afternoon, panic was setting in. I wasn't new to the woods. I had a compass, I had maps, I had experience. But none of it mattered if the landscape didn't match what I expected. I should have reached the river by now. Instead, the trees never broke, the trail never opened up. It was like the forest had swallowed me. And then I saw something ahead. A campsite, not mine. It looked abandoned. A tent, sagging and moldy, half covered in leaves. A fire pit, long cold. Rusted can scattered around, half buried in the dirt. It had been here for a long time. I stepped closer. My heart pounded in my chest. Inside the tent, there was a sleeping bag, still zipped up, still full. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The shape inside was unmistakable. My stomach turned to ice. I backed away, turned, started walking, then running. Branches scraped my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached. Then I stopped and realized the forest was silent. No birds, no wind, just my own ragged breathing. And then a single slow breath. Right behind me, I turned. Nothing, just trees. But I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't wait. I ran again, not caring where I was going, only that I had to go. I ran until I saw the road. The sight of it nearly broke me. Gravel and dirt. A faded wooden sign pointing back toward the trailhead. Civilization. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw him, standing at the tree line, just beyond the road. still, watching. Then, as I turned a corner, he was gone. I never went back, and I never will.